The Cause of All Mankind, An American Veteran's Case for Ukraine and the Next Greatest Generation by Mark J. Lindquist. Dedication. Dedicated to Gordon and Diane Lindquist. Thank you for teaching me how to serve. Epigraph. The cause of America is, in a great measure, the cause of all mankind. Thomas Paine, Philadelphia, February 14th, 1776. Author's note. For the past 4.5 years, I've kept a personal journal at the end of nearly every day in Ukraine, a practice that, by now, has grown to a couple million words. Many of the specific accounts, timelines, and details in this book are drawn directly from those journal entries, recorded the same day or the day after the events they describe, rather than reconstructed from memory years later. Where memory alone was my only source, I tried to be honest about the limits of that memory, rather than dress it up as more precise than it is. I also want to be plain about what this book is and isn't. This is one guy's view of what's happening in Ukraine, filtered through everything I am. A Minnesota farm kid, an Air Force veteran, a professional motivational speaker and storyteller. I've done my best to paint an honest, accurate picture, but it's still a single vantage point, not a comprehensive history or a neutral policy analysis. I encourage you to read other accounts alongside this one and hear other perspectives from foreign and local volunteers in Ukraine. A note on proceeds. The proceeds from the sale of this book go directly to fund the non-lethal side of the Ukrainian military units that I continue to support. Chapter 1. February 24th, 2022. I was sitting in a one-bedroom apartment on 8th Street in Moorhead, Minnesota, across the river from Fargo, North Dakota, writing like my life depended on it. Not writing for war, writing for a congressional campaign that, if I'm honest with you, most of the country never heard of. A campaign I was probably the least qualified person in America to run for Minnesota's 7th District. I'd watched both parties fumble the pandemic, watched the country calcify into two tribes shouting past each other. And I said the thing a lot of frustrated people say, and almost nobody actually does. I can do better than these jerks. So I filed. I raised a little money. I was about to register as an independent, buy a little house back in my hometown of Ortonville, Minnesota, and try to represent people with something better than what I was watching from Washington. That week, between fundraising calls, I was deep in a different kind of research. I'd been reading the founders, not the sanitized version from a high school textbook, but the actual letters of John and Abigail Adams writing to each other. Visionary words from Hamilton, the eloquence of Jefferson, the brilliance of Madison, the Federalist Papers, Rights of Man. I read about the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot once again. I wanted to understand, at the root, what these people actually thought they were building, and whether we'd kept faith with it. I was reading Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in February 1776, 246 years before the week I was sitting in that apartment, when the news broke that Russia had launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I remember that specific feeling. Not shock exactly, recognition. I'd sworn an oath once enlisting in the United States Air Force to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and by extension, I'd always believed everything that document stood for. That oath doesn't expire when your service does. Watching the second largest military on earth roll into a country I'd been told was defenseless, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I raised my right hand. And then I read the line that wouldn't leave me alone. Paine, writing about why free people have both the right and responsibility to govern themselves. The cause of America is, in a great measure, the cause of all mankind. I sat with that for hours. I knew enough as a former intelligence analyst, as someone who reads history compulsively, to understand what Ukraine actually was in that moment. Not a distant regional dispute, but a test of whether the idea Paine was describing still meant anything in 2022. If the cause of America was the cause of all mankind, then whatever was happening in Kyiv that week wasn't someone else's problem. It was the same cause, just further east. I want to be honest about that campaign, too, because I think it matters. I wasn't a nobody in that race. I'd attracted real professional political operatives, people who'd run successful campaigns for US senators, members of Congress, even presidential candidates. And they were volunteering their time, joining weekly conference calls, helping me build something they thought could actually win. I'd been in contact with the House Minority Leader's office. I talked with the Minnesota Secretary of State. There was a real path there, or at least a real possibility of one. I'm not telling you I dropped a joke of a campaign to go do something serious. I'm telling you I set aside something that mattered to me, genuinely mattered, that I'd sacrificed for, that serious people had believed in enough to lend their own time to, because I became convinced something else mattered more. That's the whole book, honestly, compressed into 1 week in Moorhead, Minnesota. Everything after this chapter is just what it looked like to act on it. Chapter 2. The Man on the BBC. A week after the invasion started, I was still glued to the news the way most of the world was. Refreshing, watching, trying to understand the shape of something that didn't have a shape yet. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had put out a call, official and direct, for a foreign legion. He was asking veterans of foreign militaries anywhere in the world to come fight for his country's freedom. I want to be precise about what a big deal that actually is, because I don't think most Americans registered it. Foreign legions don't happen every decade. They don't happen every generation. You have to go back to the French Foreign Legion, to the international brigades that formed during the Spanish Civil War to find something comparable. This wasn't a fundraising drive. This was a head of state asking strangers from other countries to come and die for his, if it came to that. And then I saw a clip from the BBC. A British veteran somewhere in London being interviewed about why he was leaving for the Ukrainian front lines. I don't know his name. I've never gone back to find that clip again. I don't need to, because I remember exactly what he said. The reporter asked him why, and he said something like, "I'm 40 years old. I've never married. No kids. I've got a flexible job. I've got military experience. A country fighting for its freedom is asking for help. What's my excuse? I feel a calling to help," he said. That was it. That was the whole interview as far as what stuck, and I remember the exact sensation of watching it. Not admiration, not even inspiration, really. Recognition. He is me. I was exactly 40 years old, never married, no kids, a flexible job. I owned my own business. Military experience spread across 6 years in a couple dozen countries. I sat there and ran through his list like it was a checklist somebody had built specifically to describe my own life, and every box came back checked. I don't know who that man was. I don't know if he ever made it to the front, what unit he joined, whether he's alive today. He has no idea he did this. But he did something that I think matters more than most people realize. He didn't try to convince me of anything. He didn't make an argument. He just told the truth about his own life out loud on camera and let the truth do the work. He set an example. That's all an example ever is. One person, visible, doing the thing, so the next person doesn't have to imagine whether it's possible. That's become the whole spine of what I've tried to do for 4.5 years now. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a general. I'm one American citizen who used the freedom available to him, the passport, the flexible schedule, the plane ticket, the choice, to go help people fighting for their own freedom. And in doing that, in front of hometowns of 2,000 people from Ortonville and 250,000 people from Fargo-Moorhead, who already knew my name from a decade of shaking their hands at high school assemblies and singing the national anthem, I became, without really planning it, the same thing that stranger on the BBC was to me. An example, not an argument, just proof an ordinary person could do it. That's the whole theory of this book, if I'm honest with you. I'm not trying to win a debate about foreign policy. I'm trying to be the guy on the BBC for a few million people who haven't seen him yet. There's a piece of what happened next that I don't think I've explained clearly enough yet, so I want to make a name for it before I go further, because it's the actual engine underneath everything in the rest of this book. What I ended up building wasn't really a solo mission. It was a partnership between me and the people back home who trusted me enough to fund it. Fargo, Ortonville, communities across Minnesota and North Dakota I'd spent a decade performing in and speaking to. Most of those people had no idea how to help Ukraine themselves. They didn't have a contact on the ground, didn't know which organizations were legitimate, didn't have a way to verify that a donated dollar actually reached a soldier instead of disappearing into overhead. What they had was me, someone whose face they already knew, whose word they already trusted, standing in the gap between their goodwill and a war zone they had no way to reach on their own. That partnership, multiplied by thousands of ordinary donations, is what turned millions of dollars moving from American pockets into Ukraine over the years that followed. I think that's the actual model worth understanding before you read the rest of this book. Not one man doing something extraordinary alone, but one man becoming a trusted bridge for people who wanted to help and simply didn't know how. Chapter 3. Sleep on it. If you're going to tell the story of a war, really tell it. As one of the people who ends up writing how history remembers it, I think you owe the reader an honest account about how the author himself got there in the first place. Years from now, somebody's going to wonder how a motivational speaker from Ortonville, Minnesota ended up on the eastern edge of a war zone with no army behind him. I think that question deserves a real answer, not a tidy one. So here's what actually went through my head as I decided to invest the freedom available to me, the same freedom the military had once taught me to take seriously, into something bigger than myself. A second time, without a uniform or an oath backing me up this time, just a decision made alone to become a new kind of force for good, one built on volunteerism, trust, and the willingness of strangers to give. Here's something people don't expect from a decision this big. It contained almost no emotion. My focus was entirely about process. The decision to go to war as a lone soldier didn't happen in one night, in one rush of adrenaline. It happened in a sequence, the same way my business partner Jared and I had made every major decision in 10 years of building a company together. You make the move, and then you sleep on it. And only if it still feels right in the morning do you commit. The plane ticket came first. I found a flight to Poland, put it in the cart, and closed the laptop. I didn't buy it that night. I let it sit there for a day, the way you'd let a hot pan cool before you touch it. And I asked myself the only question that mattered. Does this still feel true in the morning, with all the emotion drained out of it? It did. I bought the ticket the next day. Then the gear. I had found lists. American and European volunteers were compiling them in real time on Facebook, crowdsourcing what a person actually needed to survive near a front line. Body armor, a helmet, a rucksack rated for the weight, boots, a survival kit, extra batteries, MREs. I built a cart worth about $5,000. I knew some of it would take 2 weeks to ship, which meant the clock on this decision was already running whether I committed or not. I let it sit in the cart overnight anyway. Discipline doesn't get to take a night off just because the topic is bigger. The next day, I bought it. Then, over a beer, I told one of my closest friends I was nearly 100% committed to go help out in Ukraine during active war. Not to ask permission, to test the decision against another person's face. I wanted to see how it felt saying it out loud to somebody who knew me well enough to call me an idiot if I was being one. I said it. He didn't call me an idiot. I still wasn't fully committed. I noticed that about myself. Even after 2 purchases, I was holding something back. But I felt good. Then I submitted the paperwork. I filled out an application to join the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine, and I emailed it to the Ukrainian consulate whose jurisdiction covered Chicago. No drive, no in-person appointment, just a form and an email address and a send button. And then again, I slept on it. Only after all of that did I get in a car and drive south from Fargo and Moorhead to Ortonville, 2 hours down, through the flattest, most familiar country on earth, to sit at my parents' kitchen table and tell them what I was about to do. I want you to notice the order because I think the order is the argument. A plane ticket, a night. A cart full of body armor, a night. A friend's reaction, a federal application to a foreign government's military, another night. And only then, my parents. Every step had a pause built into it on purpose. This wasn't a man running toward gunfire on a feeling. This was a man testing a conviction against sleep, against a friend, against paperwork, against his own family, and having it hold up every single time. Chapter 4. Ortonville and a Kitchen Table. I've sat at that kitchen table before with news like this. It wasn't the first time, and by now my parents probably knew it wouldn't be the last. The first time I was 18, telling them I was walking away from a music scholarship to go join AmeriCorps, the Domestic Peace Corps, because I'd grown up watching my dad's slideshows from his own Peace Corps years in the late 60s, halfway around the world, and something in me wanted to answer the same call he had. Then for me, it was the military. Then it was a special duty assignment nobody in the Air Force gets easily, auditioning and getting selected for Tops in Blue, the Air Force's touring entertainment unit, which meant more years away, more countries, more of me choosing motion over settling down. And now it was Ukraine. So when I sat down and told them I'd filed paperwork with the Ukrainian consulate, that I'd bought gear, and that I was going, my mother didn't gasp. She didn't argue. She looked at me and said essentially, "Well, that makes sense. That's what Mark does." I don't think people outside of my family understand how much is packed into a sentence like that. It wasn't resignation. It wasn't blind approval either. My parents worried. Of course they worried. I was their son going to tell them he was headed to a war zone with a rucksack and a GoFundMe. But underneath the worry was something steadier. They'd watched this pattern play out enough times to trust it. They knew I didn't do reckless. They'd watched me lead volunteer teams into disaster zones in my 20s, lead troops through a mortar attack in Afghanistan in my 30s, and they knew that when I said I had the experience and the head on my shoulders to do this safely and still be useful, I wasn't saying it to reassure them. I was saying it because it was true. And they knew it was true because they'd watched me build the evidence for it, one decision at a time, for 20 years. That's the thing about a calling that keeps showing up in your life in different costumes. AmeriCorps, Air Force, Tops in Blue, Ukraine. Eventually, the people who love you stop asking you, "Why would you do this?" and start asking you, "What do you need?" My parents had reached that point long before February of 2022. The invasion didn't introduce them to who I was. It just gave the same person one more place to go. I hugged them both. A few weeks later, I hugged them again at the Fargo airport, and I got on a plane and flew east. Chapter 5. The Last Coffee in Paris. I want to tell you the truth about those flights because the truth is more useful than the version where the hero feels nothing but purpose the whole way over. I was scared. Not the kind of fear that stops you, the kind that sits in your stomach like a stone and won't dissolve no matter how many times you tell yourself you've made the right call. Somewhere over the Atlantic, and again somewhere over Western Europe, it hit me in waves. I don't actually know anything about what's in front of me. I had a Facebook thread full of names, other volunteers, other veterans, people I was supposedly going to link up with near the Polish border, and I had no idea if any of them were who they said they were. No idea if they'd show up. No idea, honestly, if I'd be walking into a group of serious people or a group of people who talked a big game online and would evaporate the moment things got real. I was about to find out entirely on my own, with no backup plan, no chain of command, nobody's orders but mine. I had a layover in Paris on the way to Warsaw, and I want to tell you about the few hours I spent there because it's become one of the moments from this whole journey I return to most. I left the airport and found a small cafe near the Notre Dame Cathedral, sat down and ordered a coffee. Still in camouflage, still carrying the weight of gear I hadn't fully adjusted to yet. People glanced at me the way the people glance at something that doesn't fit the scene. A man dressed for a war zone, sitting in one of the most beautiful, most peaceful cities on earth, holding a paper cup like it was any other morning, in the shadow of a cathedral that has stood through centuries of world history. It wasn't any other morning. I sat there and let the fear actually catch up with me for the first time since I'd left Fargo. The real weight of what I'd chosen, the reality that I was one connecting flight away from a place where people were actively trying to kill each other. I felt afraid. I felt genuinely alone in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet in all the weeks of preparation, because preparation keeps your hands busy and doesn't leave room for the feeling to land. And then, sitting there, I thought about the people I had left behind in America, but were with me still in every way that mattered. Friends and strangers back in Fargo and Ortonville. People all over the country who'd sent messages of hope, of faith, of believing in what I was doing, who'd given freely money, gear, encouragement to a guy who was, when you stripped it down, just one of their own, deciding to go do something about a problem the rest of us mostly just watch on the news. I thought about them all at once, in that cafe, holding that coffee. And the fear didn't disappear, but it stopped being something I was carrying alone. That's what that last coffee in the rear of the free world actually was. Not a peaceful moment before chaos, but the moment I understood fully that I wasn't making this trip by myself, even though I was sitting at that table alone. I picked up my deployment bag. I went back to Charles de Gaulle Airport, and I got on the flight to Warsaw. And underneath all of that, I genuinely didn't know if the Ukrainian military would take me. My intention when I filed that paperwork and packed that gear was the front line. I was wearing camouflage. I had survival gear. I trained for weeks with 100 pounds on my back specifically because I thought there was a real chance I'd end up being handed a rifle. So there was this specific, cold thought running underneath everything else on that flight. I might actually be doing this, the real version, the version where people shoot at you. I didn't sleep much across the ocean. By the time I landed in Warsaw, I was running on fumes, a body that had been training for weeks and a mind that hadn't rested in about as long, both of them showing up at once at the worst possible time to be sharp. But that feeling from the cafe in Paris never left me. This sense, low and steady under the adrenaline, that I wasn't just an individual making a reckless solo decision. I was carrying a hometown with me, 250,000 people who'd watched me sing at their football games and speak at their schools for a decade, now showing up in a different way, telling me that they believed in what I was about to do. That's what I want people to understand about courage, if that's even the right word for it. It isn't the absence of the pit in your stomach. It's putting one boot in front of the other, literally, awkwardly, 100 pounds of gear making even that simple motion hard, while the pit is still there. Because something else, something bigger and steadier, is holding you up from underneath it. I landed in Warsaw, exhausted, afraid, and certain. All three at once. I've come to believe that's what it actually feels like to do something that matters. Chapter 6. You are safe here. Before I tell you about that border, I need to tell you something that changed the entire shape of what came next. The word moving through the Facebook groups and the veteran networks in those first few weeks was that the Foreign Legion had started prioritizing combat veterans specifically, men and women with actual deployed combat experience from Iraq and Afghanistan, boots on the ground time in an active war zone. I didn't have that. 6 years in the Air Force active duty as an intelligence analyst, spending time supporting operations in Afghanistan with tops in blue and all over the Middle East. But not the specific combat infantry experience the Legion had started screening for as the volume of foreign applicants grew. I'd already filed my paperwork by the time I'd heard this, and I was told at a recruiting station near the border that if I was selected, I would get an email and a phone call confirming it. That email and phone call never came. I want to be honest about what it felt like in that moment, a strange kind of grief for a version of this trip I built up in my head for weeks. The version where I carried a rifle. But I made the decision early on, before I ever got confirmation one way or the other, that the outcome of that application wasn't actually going to determine whether I stayed in Ukraine. If I wasn't selected for the military, I knew there was no shortage of need on the civilian support side of this war. The requests coming out of the volunteer networks in those first few weeks were overwhelmingly for medical supplies, not necessarily manpower with a weapon. So I decided, before I'd even fully processed not getting picked for the Foreign Legion, that I'd hand my own gear directly to a Ukrainian soldier out east who could actually use it, and I'd go to work on the supply side instead. And that turned out to be the right call, and not just because it was the only option left to me. I understood something in that moment that took me a while to put into words. I wasn't uniquely useful as one more rifle. I was uniquely useful as an American that thousands of people back home already knew and trusted. Someone who could extend their reach and their donations all the way to the eastern edge of the free world in a way most of them never could themselves. That was the actual job, not the one I'd trained for with a rucksack, the one that was actually needed. I got to work on it within days of arriving at the border, and I haven't stopped for 4.5 years. The town where all of this started was called Przemysl. 60,000 people tucked against the Polish side of the border, a kind of place that never in its history expected to become the front door of the free world. But that's what it was in March of 2022. Outside a converted shopping center everyone just called Tesco, there was a sign that the Polish authorities had put up for the people pouring across into Poland. You are safe here. 4 words that an entire nation needed to hear, and Poland made sure they did. Inside, there were thousands of people still in transit at any given moment. Some had sleeping bags donated by Polish families. Most had thin mats on a concrete floor. The volunteers running the place were mostly Western Europeans, British, German, Dutch, multilingual, exhausted, doing triage on human need with almost no resources and no chain of command telling them how. I want to tell you about an old woman I watched one afternoon because I think about her more than almost anything else from this whole war. She was shuffling through the stanchion lines toward the registration desk, the kind of rope and pole maze you'd see at an airport, carrying everything she owned in a plastic shopping bag. One of the bags caught on a stanchion post. The bottom tore open. Everything she had left in the world spilled across the floor. She didn't speak Polish. She didn't speak English. Volunteers rushed over with a phone, Google Translate open, trying to help her gather her things and understand what she needed. She kept saying the same phrase over and over, weeping as she said it. The translation came back the same way every time. My life is on the floor. I don't know how to explain what that does to a person standing there watching it happen. These weren't people who'd packed for a trip. They'd been woken in the middle of the night by artillery, by the sound of something exploding somewhere close enough to matter, and they'd run onto trains from Kharkiv and Dnipro and Kramatorsk and Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia and Kherson and Odessa and Kyiv. Trains that hid in tree lines after dark, with every light killed because a drone or jet might be overhead. Platforms packed so tight there wasn't room for one more human body. The kind of images that belong in black and white newsreels from a war 80 years gone. Except these were modern cities, modern rail platforms, and the year was 2022. Most of these people didn't own suitcases to begin with because a suitcase is a thing you buy when you have money to travel somewhere on purpose. They came with plastic bags. And when a plastic bag fails you, your whole life is, quite literally, on the floor. If that doesn't move you to do something, I don't know what will. So the first mission, before anything else, it was simple. Get these people luggage. Something with wheels, something that wouldn't split open under the weight of the only possessions they had left. I went to the volunteers running the center and told them what I wanted to do. They told me it was pointless. The entire city was sold out of luggage. Millions of people had passed through. Every shop for miles had been stripped bare weeks earlier. I didn't believe it. Not for a town of 60,000 people with ordinary retail stores like everywhere else. I rented a van and drove into town myself. By the second store, I'd found dozens of suitcases sitting on the shelves. By the third, I'd spent a couple $1,000s, money that people back in Ortonville and Fargo had donated, and filled the van twice over. I handed out 50, 75 suitcases directly to the people inside, and the need swallowed every single one before I'd even made it back to the back of the building. That taught me something I'd carry with me for the next 4.5 years. The fog of war doesn't stay at the front line. It reaches all the way back to a refugee center on the safe side of the border in the mouths of well-meaning people who are too exhausted, too overwhelmed, or simply too far from the ground truth to know it's changed. Nobody at that center was lying to me. They believed what they told me. It just wasn't true anymore, and it stayed untrue in their minds until somebody bothered to go check. There's a second story from that same building that I think people need to hear because it complicates the tidy version of this war that gets told back home. The one where Poland is simply, uncomplicatedly heroic. Full stop. Poland was heroic. The government opened the border to millions of people with almost no notice and no hesitation, and that fact should never be minimized. But the machinery underneath that heroism had its own failures. If you showed up with donated supplies at Tesco, the refugee center, the security guard at the entrance wouldn't let you walk them in the front door. He'd direct you east, around back, to the loading docks on the northeast side of the building where the Polish military maintained a supply warehouse. Anything you brought went in through that door and effectively got seized by the process there. Cataloged, itemized, boxed, down to the individual toothbrushes and pairs of socks, and then it just stopped moving. That loading dock is where donated supplies from the Western world went to die. If a refugee inside the building wanted a toothbrush, in theory, they filled out paperwork and requested one. And if the person on duty that day felt like digging through the boxes to find it, maybe they got it. Mostly, they didn't. Not out of cruelty, out of the ordinary grinding bureaucratic inertia that shows up anywhere, even in the middle of the worst humanitarian crisis Europe had seen in decades. The volunteers figured out a workaround fast, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't use it. You told the checkpoint guard in the parking lot that your van was empty and that you had nothing to declare, and you drove straight to the front door instead of that loading dock, and you handed your donated supplies directly to the people who needed them. No paperwork, no cataloging, no delay between what a refugee actually needed and receiving it directly from us. How messed up is it that the fastest, most reliable path to getting a grieving old woman a toothbrush was to lie to a checkpoint guard about what was in your trunk? That's just what bureaucracy does under pressure everywhere. And it's a lesson worth remembering for anyone who thinks the solution to a crisis is always more official process. That's not a criticism of Poland. Well, maybe it is a little bit. Any Ukrainian or expat volunteer out here will tell you a personal story of someone in Poland near the border acting not with compassion, but disdain and entitlement, unthinkable in a time of crisis. That loading dock at Tesco taught me the single most important operating principle I carried with me for the next 4.5 years, and I've never once broken it since. Don't let a government entity take custody of your supplies. The moment that something you're donating passes into a government warehouse, a government process, a government chain of custody, even a well-intentioned one, even an allied one, the odds that it actually reaches the person who needs it start dropping fast. Not because anyone along that chain is corrupt or lazy necessarily, though sometimes they are. It's simpler than that. Bureaucracy adds friction, and friction in a crisis costs lives. So the rule I've operated by since that loading dock in Chemish is this. Supplies go from hand to hand. From me, or a volunteer I trust, directly to the soldier, the medic, or the civilian who's going to use it. Or at the most, one hand removed, to a family member or close friend who I know will get it to them within a day. That's it. No warehouse in the middle, no form, no custody transfer to anyone whose job is process rather than people. That's how virtually every serious volunteer I've worked with for 4.5 years operates. 20,000 Americans, hundreds of thousands of Europeans, millions of Ukrainian citizens doing their own version of this. We're not acting in opposition to any government. We fully support what the Ukrainian government and military are trying to accomplish. We've simply learned the hard way that a private point-to-point supply chain, one human being carrying something directly to another human being who needs it, outperforms a government-administered one nearly every time, at nearly every scale we've operated at. I've come to think of it as one of the quieter lessons of this whole war. In a crisis, the fastest and most reliable channel is usually the one with the fewest hands in the middle. I'll say this plainly because I think it's worth saying rather than dancing around. If you're a conservative reading this book, I think that principle should resonate with you specifically. It's not a coincidence that a private, decentralized, individually accountable supply chain has consistently outperformed the government-run alternative in the parts of the war that I've personally witnessed. I believe the private solution is very often the better solution, not because government is malicious, but because government moves through process, and process is slow precisely when speed is what saves a life. That's not a partisan talking point to me. It's 4.5 years of watching with my own eyes which channel actually gets a tourniquet into a soldier's hand before he bleeds out, and which one leaves it sitting in a warehouse being cataloged. The last lesson from Shemish is the one that shaped everything I did for the rest of the war. Go to the source. Even the volunteers passing along information about what the front lines needed, sincere, hard-working, well-meaning people, most weren't military. They didn't know what a medical-grade tourniquet looked like versus a cheap imitation. They didn't know what combat medicine was or what military grade actually meant in a supply chain sense. So the requests moving east to west, back from the front toward the rear, and the supplies moving west to east to meet them, both got blurry fast, garbled, outdated, sometimes just wrong. The same way the luggage story had been wrong, multiplied across 100 different requests a day. The only fix was to go yourself. Talk to the guy in the trench, not the volunteer relaying what the guy in the trench supposedly said 3 phone calls ago. The guy himself, with the translator standing next to you, asking him directly what he needed. And that meant going east, toward Kharkiv, toward Kramatorsk, toward the places within range of the artillery, at a time when almost everyone else on that border was moving in the opposite direction. Most of the volunteers I met were too afraid to make that trip, and I understood why. The fear was rational. But if you wanted the truth instead of the fog, east was the only direction that got you there. So that's where we went next. Chapter 7. Lviv. The first air raid siren I heard in Lviv came at some hour past midnight, and it took me a full 3 or 4 seconds to place what I was even hearing, because nothing in my body had a file for it. Then it clicked. The last time was Afghanistan in 2011. And by the time it clicked, I was already sitting upright in a dark apartment with my heart going, waiting for whatever came next. If you've grown up in the United States, the only siren you're conditioned to know is a tornado siren, tested at noon on the first Wednesday of every month, a sound so routine it barely registers. This was different. Not because the odds were actually high. I mean, in a city of 1 million people, the statistical odds of a given siren meaning something was going to land anywhere near you were genuinely low. The same math I'd learned to hold on to in Afghanistan. But knowing the math doesn't fully disarm the sound. It's not that it's scary exactly. It's unsettling in a way that reaches somewhere underneath logic. Morning, noon, and night, waking you out of sleep again and again, a sound your nervous system has no filed category for because you've never needed one. You lie there afterward in the dark, listening for the second sound, the one that would tell you whether this particular siren meant something or nothing. And you never quite get used to the listening, even after you've heard it 100 times. I say this because I want to make a point that mattered to me the whole time I've been out here. Everybody's first air raid siren deserves grace, not judgment. If you watch someone freeze or go pale or overreact the first time they hear one, don't think less of them for it. They're reacting exactly the way a person from the free world is supposed to react to a sound the free world doesn't require you to know. That fear isn't weakness. It's just evidence of where you're from. Building an actual team out here happened almost entirely through phones. Facebook groups first, then the conversation would migrate to Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, because that's where the real information lived, the stuff too specific or too sensitive for a public group. And the value of those chats was enormous, because every volunteer who'd been in country 2 weeks longer than you had already solved problems you hadn't hit yet. Who could actually fix a vehicle? Who could get you a rental? How you got train tickets? Which checkpoints were tight and which were loose? What documents you needed to be carrying at all times? None of that was written down anywhere official. It existed only because one foreign volunteer had learned it the hard way and decided to pass it forward instead of hoarding it. That's how I met the guy who became my closest partner that first stretch. A lineman for PG&E out of California, someone I'd found through one of those Facebook groups who'd come out entirely on his own volition, no organization behind him, just a decision like mine. We'd crossed paths in Warsaw, ended up at the refugee center in Przemyśl together, and by the time we'd reached Lviv, we'd more or less decided to run as a team. I rented an Airbnb in the city center with enough room for 5 or 6 guys, couches, floors, whatever space existed. And since I'd spent a decade working as a motivational speaker with some money saved, I covered it. Not because I was trying to run an operation, but because there were guys out there who were serious about helping and needed a floor to sleep on. And I had a floor. You may be asking, how do you build trust with strangers in a situation like this? Here's the honest answer: coffee. I want to describe what that actually looked like because coffee undersells it and how deliberate it was. You'd sit across a small table from someone you'd only known as a name and a profile photo an hour earlier, and you'd watch. Not interrogate, watch. Did they know exactly where they'd be sleeping that night? Or were they vague about it in a way that suggested that they had no plan at all? Did they mention, casually, details about a supply route or a contact's name in a public cafe loud enough for the next table to hear? Did the conversation keep drifting back to themselves, the story they'd tell when they got home, the photo they wanted? Or did it stay on the actual work in front of us? You could feel the difference inside 20 minutes, almost every time. You have to understand, Ukraine is the most accessible war zone in history. A plane ticket to a neighboring country and your American passport gets you across the border, moving around the country with almost no friction at all. That accessibility was a gift for people who were serious, and it was a magnet for people who weren't. War tourists, people who'd watched too many movies and wanted the photo, the story, the feeling, without any real intention of being useful or any real understanding of operational security. The basic discipline of not posting your location, not talking about supply routes online, not becoming a liability to the people around you. My 10 years as a speaker had sharpened something in me. Reading a room, reading a person, feeling out fast whether that somebody was solid or whether they were full of it. And that skill turned out to be the single most useful thing I brought into that first year. More than the gear, more than the money. I probably sat down for more coffees that year in 2022 than I did anything else besides physically moving supplies and moving money. Because the network of people you could actually trust with your life was the real infrastructure underneath everything else we built. Get that wrong, and in the wrong situation, someone doesn't just waste your time, they get you killed. So we vetted, one coffee at a time, and the ones who passed became the team that went east with me. Chapter 8: The PT Cruiser. I met 2 of the men who'd shaped that first year at baggage claim in the Warsaw airport of all places. Both of us in camouflage, both instantly recognizing what that meant on another American in that specific airport in March of 2022. Turned out they were former Marines out of New York. We exchanged information right there and kept in touch. They went immediately into Ukraine as they'd already joined a Ukrainian military unit working at the front. One of them was a combat medic and the other an infantryman who spent his days firing RPGs at tanks and getting shelled by artillery in return. When they came back through Kyiv for a short rest, they told me about the guys they'd been fighting alongside and what those guys actually needed. Auto tools, basic mechanics tools, the kind you'd find at a Napa or an AutoZone back home, because the vehicles ferrying wounded soldiers to combat aid stations kept breaking down and there was nothing to fix them with. I'd raised money for exactly this kind of thing. So we drove out to Dnipro, a city of about 1 million people out east, the nearest place you could actually buy this stuff, and bought everything on the list. The vehicles at the front needed those tools immediately. Every day without them was a day a broken down evac vehicle sat useless instead of moving wounded men to help. So we left later than we should have, closer to nightfall than any of us wanted. Somebody navigating from memory on a rural back road that thinned from blacktop highway down to something closer to a minimum maintenance gravel road. We took a wrong turn, an hour out of the city in the dark. One of our tires blew. We were out there on the shoulder of a farm road with headlamps and cell phone flashlights, mosquitoes finding every inch of exposed skin, wrestling a jack and lug nuts by feel, while somewhere off in the distance we could hear explosions. Close enough that the sound wasn't abstract anymore. We radioed ahead on signal to the guys we were meeting. Delayed, flat tire, working on it. We finally rolled up to their position at around 3 a.m. A bombed-out schoolhouse in a village of maybe a few hundred people, brick construction, a steel door, a little yard with sheds and an old lawnmower, now serving as the barracks for the unit sleeping inside. Headlights off the whole approach because the last thing you do near a frontline position at night is light yourself up for anyone watching. None of us spoke Ukrainian. We knocked. The Marine who'd fought with these guys called out their commander's call sign and pulled up Google Translate on his phone to say, in effect, "We're Americans. We're the good guys. We're here with the tools." 10 men standing in the dark outside a building full of armed men whose gate guard had not gotten the message that we were coming. I've thought since how easily that could have gone a different way. It didn't. Within a few minutes, they sorted out who we were, and they unlocked the schoolroom door for us. I want to slow down on what happened next, because I think it says more about these men than almost anything else I could tell you about them. Before they showed any of us where to lie down, the soldiers went and gathered their own pillows and their own blankets, the bedding they themselves were using that night, and they handed them over to 10 strangers who'd showed up in the middle of the night to help. They made sure that we were comfortable before they worried about themselves again. That's not a small gesture from men who had almost nothing spare to give. The room itself was wood floors, windows blown out entirely, no glass left anywhere to keep the night air out. It was the middle of the summer, and it was still cold enough that we slept in our jackets. 10 of us on the floor of that room, most of us strangers to each other a week earlier, listening to artillery impact somewhere out past the tree line for most of the night. Close enough that you felt each one land as much as heard it, never quite able to tell if the next one was going to be closer than the last. I didn't sleep much. I don't think anyone did. At some point in the night, one of the soldiers from another part of the barracks got up to use the toilet and walked past our room. He hadn't been there when we arrived at 3 a.m, hadn't been briefed by his commander that 10 strangers were now sleeping 20 feet from him inside his own barracks. I remember the look on his face, half asleep, trying to work out who we were and why we were there in a building where the answer to that was a question that usually mattered. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody raised their voice. But there was a beat, a genuinely uncomfortable beat for a few seconds, where I understood exactly how easily unfamiliar shapes in the dark on a frontline position in the middle of the night without a full briefing passed down the chain could go wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions. It didn't go wrong. He worked it out, or decided it wasn't his problem to work out at that hour, and he went back to his own room. But I've never forgotten that feeling, being, for a few seconds, the unexplained thing in someone else's war. It was a genuinely frightening night, and I'll tell you honestly what got me through it. I was an Air Force intelligence guy who sat at a desk, who qualified on an M16 exactly once in basic training, and the guy next to me put 3 rounds of his own into my own target by accident. Nobody wants the Air Force covering them when things go bad. But that night, I wasn't relying on my own marksmanship or skills as a soldier. I had U.S. Marines on one side of me and a Ukrainian infantryman on the other, men who actually knew how to fight, and that's what let me close my eyes at all. I still have a photo from the next morning. Those guys with the tools all laid out on the ground in front of them, grinning as wide as I've ever seen anyone grin, next to the vehicles, pockmarked with shrapnel holes from runs they'd already made. That's the whole transaction, reduced to one picture. A flat tire in the dark, a school full of soldiers, and men who could go back to fixing the vehicles that carried their friends to safety. The second story from that stretch happened on a road out to Pokrovsk, which became our forward base of operations in the Donbass for a while. A small city that still had a working gas station or two, a grocery store, half of its population already gone, but enough infrastructure left that volunteers like us could still rent a room and stage out of it. On the way out, same as before, another tire blown, another roadside repair job, this time as the sun was setting somewhere in open Donbass country. While we worked on it, a convoy passed us. Personal vehicles, not armored transports, not Humvees, nothing built for this. Ukraine's citizen soldiers, they don't have the equipment that we're used to seeing American troops move around in. I remember straightening up from the jack for a second to watch them go by, headlights catching the dust they were kicking up off the shoulder, engines straining under the weight they were never designed to carry. These were men who'd been school teachers and security guards and hotel doormen the week before, now driving the same cars they used to buckle their kids into, painted field green with a brush and whatever paint they could find, a welded bench seat crammed into the back to fit more men than the manufacturer ever intended. One that passed us was a PT Cruiser. I actually laughed, like a short, disbelieving laugh before I caught myself because of how absurd and how completely unabsurd it was at the same time. 8 guys packed inside. I mean, big men, Ukrainian size, 6 feet and 230 pounds apiece. Knees up to their chests, folded into a car built for hauling a suburban family to soccer practice, now headed toward the largest land war in Europe since 1945. I watched its taillights disappear down that road into the dark, and I thought about how many more of those I'd see before this war was over, and how many of them wouldn't make the return trip. That's the image that explains why vehicles became the most requested, most constant needs of the entire war. These cars have no armor to speak of, maybe a scrap of body armor zip-tied to a door panel, something to slow shrapnel by a fraction of a second if it ever came to that. The sheet metal on a normal car does nothing against artillery fragments. And these are vehicles running troops, running medical evacuations, running supplies up and down the roads within range of Russian guns every single day. The average lifespan of one of these vehicles at the front is measured in weeks, sometimes less. When they're hit, they're stripped for parts, and the fleet needs replacing immediately because the war doesn't pause for a supply gap. That's why every few months, we put together a convoy if we can, 10, 20 vehicles at a time, roughly $250,000 worth, and drive them across the border ourselves, hand them over to a Ukrainian military logistics guy in Kyiv who'd outfit what little protection they could and send them straight back out to the front lines. Not weapons, not lethal aid, just vehicles that keep a wounded man's chances alive long enough to reach someone who can actually save him. Chapter 9. Kharkiv Nights. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, 1.2 million people before the invasion, a major university town, home to what I believe is the largest city square in Europe. It sits about 15 miles from the Russian border, close enough that when the Russians pushed hard in the summer of 2022, their artillery and rocket lines advanced to within roughly 8 miles of the city's northern edge. Down in Dnipro, I asked locals what they were hearing out of Kharkiv, because the reports were bad, really bad. Nobody wanted to go up there. One man told me flatly there was no point because there was nobody left in Kharkiv anymore. I want to say something carefully here because I respect this man, and I respect every Ukrainian I've ever gotten information from. They are, as a rule, the best source of ground truth there is. But in this particular case, distance and the fog of war had done what they do. He wasn't lying. He just wasn't right. In a city of 1.2 million people, it doesn't just simply empty out. And I said so. And I got in a volunteer van with a translator and drove north to see for myself. We found people living in a subway station on the northern edge of the city, a stop called Heroyev Pratsy, close to where the artillery, drones, and rockets were actually landing. American and European volunteers met me at street level and walked me down past a security guard checking everyone who came through into the station itself. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Damp and musty, the particular smell of concrete that's never supposed to be lived in being lived in anyway. At the far end of the platform, it looked like a homeless encampment. People had staked out small patches of ground for themselves, their belongings arranged around them in whatever order made sense to them, sleeping on bare concrete because that's what was available. About 10 children were down there, 5 to 10 years old, some of them living permanently in a subway station, and the moment we showed up with candy we'd brought, we were swarmed. Kids who hadn't seen a stranger bring anything just for them in longer than any child should have to go with that. I wanted to give them everything I had in that moment, and candy was what I had. They'd been down there since February 24th of 2022. It was June by the time I got there. I met a volunteer named Chip, part of the core team that had been keeping those people alive for months while most of the world had quietly filed Kharkiv under abandoned and moved on. 4 months underground by the time I met them. This wasn't a temporary shelter for these families anymore. It was simply where they live now, because they had nowhere else to go and no money to get there if they had. I want you to understand why that particular subway stop, of all places. It sits in the northern part of the city, closest you can get within Kharkiv itself, to the direction the Russians were pushing from, which means artillery, bombs, missiles, rockets, and drones had landed around that subway station constantly, because the Russians could see there were people gathering and they treated it like any other target. One day, while we were on site, a friend of mine caught shrapnel from a nearby explosion. It tore up his leg, though we got lucky and it wasn't serious. A cell phone kiosk about 25 yards from the station entrance was blown apart in the same strike. I remember standing there thinking about what that actually meant. These were people the war had already made homeless once, and the war was still coming for them where they'd landed, in a subway station, refusing to let them alone in the one place they had left. There's a specific afternoon I'll never forget. A volunteer group had set up a pizza wagon outside the subway entrance, and a line of about 150 people had formed for free food. We were terrified the whole time. 8 miles from the front is well within the range of everything the Russians had, and a crowd that size, gathered in one visible place outdoors, is exactly the kind of target that gets hit. But the people needed to eat, and if we hadn't fed them that day, they'd have gone hungry. So we stood there, scanning the sky as much as the crowd, and we did it anyway. And I was right about the rest of it too, about Kharkiv. There were still restaurants open, still the university, empty for the summer, but some faculty roamed around the campus. Hotels were still operating, still a produce market operating every single day where people brought vegetables to sell, because that's what survival looks like when you refuse to stop being a functioning person. The population had thinned dramatically. My best guess, 50 to 100,000 people, still in a city built for over 1 million. Enough that you could park anywhere downtown that summer because there weren't enough cars left to fill the spaces. But it wasn't a ghost town. It was a wounded city, still breathing, still mostly forgotten by the volunteer world because everybody assumed what that man in Dnipro assumed. So I planted my flag there for a few months. I extended my supply line north to Kharkiv and did what I could for the civilians, the local government, and the special forces units defending a city that would have been an enormous prize for Russia to take. I rented an apartment in a northwest neighborhood called Saltivka from someone who'd fled, and I slept there most nights about 8 miles away from the front. You can't drive one city block in Kharkiv without seeing the marks of war. Shrapnel scars, gutted buildings, the city administration building in the city center beaten to pieces by what looked like both small arms and artillery fire, evidence that the fighting had, at some point, reached the center of town itself. I don't know the last time that you were genuinely afraid. I'll tell you about mine. Our apartment faced north, toward Russia. At night, you'd hear the siren, and then you'd watch the horizon. A glow would start to build, small and intensely bright at the center, like a golf ball of light forming out of nothing. And then the missile would break the cloud ceiling, and you could actually track the red streak of it rising before it vanished back into the clouds. Then you waited. About 90 seconds later, somewhere close, the explosion would land. Close enough, more than once, to set off car alarms on our block. That's not a special occurrence I'm describing. That's what the people of Kharkiv lived through and are living through as a matter of routine, every single night, which tells you everything you need to know about why over 1 million of them left and never looked back. One night, a strike landed on a building about 70 yards from ours, and it caught fire. I stayed anyway, for a few months, because I believed the people who were still there needed to know one thing above everything else, that the free world hadn't forgotten them. That was the whole mission. Some nights, just being present, showing up every day so that an American veteran's presence in the worst part of the worst city said, without needing to say it out loud, "You have not been abandoned." And because of who I am, I've been a singer since I was 13, standing in the choir loft at Zion Lutheran in Ortonville, then the Ortonville High School Choir, the Minnesota All-State Lutheran Choir, singing the national anthem under Friday Night Lights, earning a music scholarship to Concordia College, eventually fronting a 17-piece Sinatra big band, singing the national anthem for NFL games on national television. I decided the best thing I had to offer Kharkiv that summer wasn't just supplies. It was a concert. I linked up with a 12-piece student big band out of Poltava, university kids led by a director who didn't speak a word of English. And in late July of 2022, we put together a Sinatra concert in a bunker in Kharkiv. I want to tell you where that idea actually came from because it matters. My first instinct wasn't to do this myself. It was to reach out to the USO, the organization that spent 80 years doing exactly this kind of morale work for American troops overseas. I asked them plainly if there was anything they could do for the people of Kharkiv. The answer I got back was, since the United States wasn't officially a combatant in this war, their hands were tied. Their mission wouldn't allow them to operate in Ukraine. I understood the answer. I didn't like it. And somewhere in that disappointment, the actual idea took shape. If the USO couldn't do it, I could. I didn't need an official mission or an act of Congress to decide that a bombed-out city deserved live music. I just needed a band, a bunker, and a reason to believe that it mattered. So I built what the USO couldn't build, on the eastern edge of the free world, with whatever I already had. I want to describe that room because it wasn't a basement or a repurposed cellar. It was a real bomb shelter, built with concrete walls thick enough to actually mean something. Roughly half the size of a gymnasium with multiple levels connected by stairways. A balcony looked down over a lower level where the band and I performed. The local media hub, Kharkiv's press and communications operation, had made part of that space their working headquarters, and there was even an art exhibit built into the structure, like the building had been part historical museum before it became what it was that night. There was room for a couple hundred people, and a couple hundred people showed up. Not shoulder to shoulder, but full of people who hadn't fled. People who needed something other than sirens for 90 minutes. I coordinated with the local media hub to get the word out. I opened the show singing the Ukrainian national anthem in Ukrainian, wearing my U.S. Air Force dress blues, the same uniform I wear singing the national anthem in America at Soldier Field for the Bears NFL Salute to Service every single year. And then spent the next hour and a half in a tuxedo and in sequins, singing Frank Sinatra to a room full of people who hadn't heard anything but sirens and explosions in months. I've done hundreds of performances across my career all over the world, and that night in Kharkiv was the first time in my life that an audience brought me back for 4 separate encores. I didn't need anyone to tell me what that meant. I could feel it in the room, that this wasn't just entertainment, it was something closer to oxygen. Most of the people in that bunker didn't speak much English. It didn't matter. They knew Sinatra. They knew the Great American Songbook the way people everywhere seem to, somehow, regardless of language. And so for 90 minutes, an American veteran stood in a bomb shelter in eastern Ukraine singing the songs of a dead American artist, and a room full of Ukrainians who had been living under Russian rockets for months sang every word right back at me. I'd learned from my years touring with Tops in Blue, performing for deployed troops in Afghanistan and all over the Middle East, that people living inside a war need reminding every so often that the world still contains something other than war. I don't think anyone else in the volunteer world out there thought to do what we did that night, or was positioned to do it. It took the specific, strange combination of things I happened to be. A veteran, a singer, someone who already knew what it meant to perform for people living inside a war zone because I'd done it once before in uniform in Afghanistan over a decade earlier. That night in the bunker for 90 minutes, the war didn't go away, but it stopped being the only thing in the room. People still bring that concert up to me today. I've thought a lot about why that night worked the way it did, and I've landed on this. It cost almost nothing in dollars, and it mattered enormously anyway. Not every way to help a place like Kharkiv requires a supply convoy or a war bonds-sized commitment. Sometimes it's a skill you already have, offered without waiting to be asked. That Kharkiv concert turned out to be one of the first of many, not a one-time thing. Some of the most important memories and moments I've had in 4.5 years out here have been exactly this: performing for frontline soldiers, units rotating back from active combat. I remember one performance for a group of guys recently out of a trench outside Bakhmut. among the hardest fighting of this entire war, and I sang songs about love, about happiness, about a brighter time ahead to men who are, by any measure, among the toughest living human beings on earth, defenders of the free world who'd been living inside something most of us can't fully picture. We didn't share a language. It didn't matter. I watched grown men, hardened by things I'll never fully understand, get tears in their eyes. We hugged afterward, unable to exchange more than a few words, and it didn't matter one bit. Some things don't need translation. Music is one of them. Just showing up a few miles from the front, offering the gift of caring in the universal language of music and respect does something for morale I don't think any supply drop can replace. That's not a lesser form of help than a truckload of tourniquets. It's just a different one, and I've come to believe that both are necessary. I'd rather you finish this chapter wondering what your version of that concert is than simply wondering what happened to the kids in the subway station. Both questions matter, and I've tried to give you a real way to act on either one before this book runs out of pages. Chapter 10. The Translator. I want to tell this next part honestly, including the part where I might have been wrong, because I think it matters more than the parts where I was right. The translator I've been working with in Kharkiv was Iranian-born, fluent in Ukrainian, educated at Ivano-Frankivsk National University, someone who'd built a life in the country and was willing to go as far east as I was willing to go, which at that point was rare enough on its own to make him valuable. He slept in the room next to mine in whatever apartment we'd rented. I trusted him enough for that, which tells you something about how much I trusted him. And I want to say something plainly here because I think it matters more than it might seem to at first. His being Iranian-born was never at any point a reason for me to be suspicious of him. I was raised the child of an adoption myself. Born in South Korea, a few miles from the North Korean border, I was brought to a farm in Minnesota by parents who judged me by nothing except who I actually was. I know exactly what it feels like to be sized up by where you're from instead of who you are. And I wasn't going to do that to another person just because his passport made some people nervous. Ukrainians who'd known his family for years had vouched for him before I ever met him. He earned my trust the same way anyone earns trust out here. Over time, through consistency, through showing up when it mattered. I was a guy alone in a war zone, relying on instinct because instinct was often the only tool I had available to me. If someone trained in human intelligence wants to tell me, with the benefit of hindsight and a desk somewhere safe, that I made a foolish call letting him that close, I'll tell them plainly. Dude, you weren't there. I was working with the best information I had from people I trusted in real time, and I don't believe his country of origin should have been part of that calculation any more than mine should be a part of how anyone judges me. And then, gradually, something started to feel off. I can't give you a clean list of specific actions. That's the part of this that makes it kind of unsettling. It wasn't one incident. It was a pattern of small things that didn't sit right. The kind of low-grade signal that any of you who have ever worked in security or intelligence know not to ignore just because you can't fully articulate it yet. We decided to cut ties. In the days after, I asked around quietly through contacts whether Ukrainian intelligence had anything on him. What came back wasn't a clean answer. Probably a good guy, they said, but not certain. And there was a possibility, unconfirmed, of some prior connection to Iran's IRGC. I want you to sit with how that landed for me. A former U.S. intelligence analyst, someone trained specifically to read these signals, who might have spent months sleeping in the next room over from someone with a possible tie to a designated foreign terrorist organization. I don't know to this day whether that was true. I'm not telling you it was. I'm telling you that it was possible, and the possibility alone was enough to change everything about how safe I felt in that city. Whatever the truth was, the relationship had deteriorated to a point where words got ugly between us, and I made a decision. I wasn't staying one more night in the apartment we'd been sharing. I packed everything I owned, threw his belongings in a dumpster, and drove, after curfew, through military checkpoints, alone in the dark, to a hotel across the city somewhere that he wouldn't know to find me. That's the drive I want to describe to you, because it's the one that actually happened in the dark past curfew with no translator and no backup. Not a drive out of Kharkiv itself, but across it, from one location to a safer one before I left the city entirely the next day. I'll never forget that drive. Kharkiv kills its street lights at night on purpose. Nothing to illuminate a target for anyone watching from above. So you're navigating entirely by your own headlights, watching for military checkpoints that could appear at any bend in the road. I was alone. I was scared. I'll be honest. Before I left, I spent one more night in a hotel in that city, and I'll tell you exactly what that night looked like, because I think pretending it was calmer than it was would be its own kind of lie. I negotiated with the hotel owner to park my car behind the building, gated, next to his own vehicle so it wouldn't sit exposed on the street where a license plate could be read by the wrong person. I slept with a knife on the nightstand. I recorded a video and made sure it uploaded to the cloud before I went to sleep. My last known position, instructions on how to retrieve my things. Essentially, a message meant for people to find if I didn't wake up. I don't know if any of that was rational. It might have been adrenaline talking, a mind running on too little sleep and too much uncertainty, manufacturing threat where none existed. But it was real to me on that night. And the American volunteers I trusted most, when I told them what was going on, they agreed that I needed to get out. Looking back now, I don't believe I was ever in any actual danger. I don't believe the man I'd worked with was a bad person. I think it was the wrong set of circumstances at the wrong time, in a city already primed for fear by months of missiles. And everyone involved, including me, got shaken by it. The next day I drove to Poltava, about an hour and a half from the front, and I didn't feel my shoulders drop until I got there. I want to close this chapter honestly rather than neatly. I don't know exactly what happened to him after that. What I've heard, secondhand, through the loose network of volunteers who tend to eventually hear something about everyone who's passed through this war, is that he ended up somewhere in Eastern Europe, not in Ukraine anymore. I haven't gone looking for more than that, and I want to be honest about why. It was never a big enough deal to me, once the fear of that particular week passed, to spend energy chasing down an answer. I made the decision that felt right with the information I had at the time. I've let it stay exactly that, unresolved, ever since. And I think that's simply the true ending of this story, rather than one I've dressed up to feel more complete than it actually is. Chapter 11. Rebecca and the Farmhouse. Rebecca is a combat medic and nurse from Colorado. If you spent any time around the front lines in eastern Ukraine, you know her name. She's been out here for 4.5 years, saving guys' lives with almost nothing but donated supplies and her own two hands. I connected with her through a Signal group, and one day she sent a request, an urgent supply need. Nobody else positioned to deliver it, and I was close enough and free enough to go. I borrowed a truck from Ukrainian friends in Kyiv, drove out to Pokrovsk, bought what I could find locally, pulled cash from an ATM for the rest, and loaded the truck with everything her list called for. Then I drove east, toward the safe house she and a small unit of Ukrainian soldiers were operating out of, men whose nightly job, some of them, was disarming unexploded ordnance. Sappers. On the drive out to Rebecca's position, the GPS died. You get close enough to the front, 3, 4, 5 miles, I genuinely didn't want to know the exact number, and the satellite navigation just stops being reliable. All I had left was a screenshot of the route I'd taken of a photo earlier, and Google Maps. And in places like that, Google Maps will confidently show you a road that turns out to be a field. I ended up in exactly that situation. Stopped in the middle of open farmland at night, it's dark, pitch dark, the headlights the only light for miles, faced with a fork. A dirt track going right, a dirt track going left. I knew that a handful of miles in the wrong direction sat Donetsk City, occupied by the Russians. And I had no way of knowing which one of those two paths was covered by a Ukrainian checkpoint and which simply wasn't manned, because the front out there was so thin that entire stretches of the road might have had no fixed defensive position at all, just drone coverage or artillery on call and hope. No cell signal to check with anyone, no way to raise the people I was trying to reach and get to. Just a guess, made alone in the dark, with real consequences on either side of being wrong. I came up over a low rise and saw a glow on the horizon, the lights of a city, likely Donetsk itself or close to it, and I had to choose. I picked one. I don't know to this day with certainty what would have happened if I picked the other, and I'm not going to dramatize it into something I can't verify. I'll tell you honestly, I don't know if it was a 50-50 coin flip between a supply drop for the good guys and a Russian checkpoint. Or something less dramatic than that, maybe. What I know is, in that moment, with no information to work from, it felt exactly that serious. Turns out that I guessed correctly. I drove into the farmhouse yard with my lights cut, found my way inside by flashlight and candlelight, and the soldiers there showed me a place to sleep. We unloaded everything Rebecca's team needed, enough to carry them for a few more days. The next day, I stayed on and spent it out on a firing range with about 40 of the guys from that unit, helping run a combat medic training session, teaching tourniquet application to soldiers who, in some cases, had never formally been taught that, giving them what encouragement I could as an American veteran before they went back out to do their job. Those men were the sappers that I mentioned, whose nightly work was disarming unexploded ordnance along that stretch of the front lines. I want to tell you plainly that as far as I know, none of the men in that particular squad are alive today. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment instead of moving past it because I think it's the truest thing in this chapter, and I almost let it go by too fast. 40 guys. I have photos of that day on my phone. Men laughing at something one of them said mid-demonstration, men posing with a tourniquet half wrapped around a buddy's arm for the camera, men who fed me lunch and asked me questions about America and told me through a translator what they missed most before the war. A year later, by what I've been told, every one of them was gone. That's not a statistic. That's 40 specific faces I can still picture. 40 names I once knew, even if I've since forgotten most of them. 40 people who existed in a specific field on a specific afternoon and do not exist anymore. I want to tell you something about the units I've spent time with out on the front lines because I think it changes how this should land. These aren't rows of 20-year-olds the way you might picture a modern military. Every Ukrainian unit I've ever trained with, resupplied, or slept beside has had more gray hair in it than you'd expect. Men in their 60s, sometimes older, who volunteered specifically so a younger man, often their own son, wouldn't have to. I've met fathers who told me plainly that they'd rather be the one in the trench than let their boy take that risk instead. I've met grandfathers doing the work of infantrymen a third their age. That's not a detail I'm including for color. It's the actual shape of who is dying in this war. Fathers, grandfathers, brothers, uncles, cousins, husbands, men who made a specific, deliberate choice to stand between the people they loved and the thing coming for their country. This is the part of the weight of this work that doesn't show up in a supply manifest or a donation total. It's not the fear of the night I spent with a knife on the nightstand or the fork in the road with no GPS. It's this. You meet 40 men. You laugh with them. You eat what little they have to offer. You break bread with them. You teach them how to save each other's lives. And then time passes, and you find out that the saving didn't take, that the war simply kept what it came for. I carry that. I think everyone who does this work carries some version of it, whether or not they ever say so out loud. So let me say the one thing that feels honest to say at the end of this chapter. To the men on that firing range outside Pokrovsk, whoever is able to still read this, and to the families of whoever isn't, I remember you. I remember the tourniquet drills and the questions about America and the lunch you shared with a stranger who'd gotten lost in the dark trying to find you the night before. You were fathers and grandfathers and husbands and brothers and cousins and sons who chose, with open eyes, to stand in the place you stood. I don't know all of your names anymore, and that fact alone tells you something true about how many men like you this war has asked for. But I knew you for a day, and that day mattered to me, and it still does. I'm not going to pretend there's a clean action that undoes what happened to those 40 men, because there isn't. But there are other units right now doing exactly what they were doing that afternoon, training with whatever tourniquets and whatever encouragement a volunteer can bring them, hoping it's enough. That's the direct, unbroken line between this chapter and something you can actually do tonight. And I'd rather you know it exists now while these men are still real to you than lose that thread by the time you reach the last page. Chapter 12, Tatiana's Roof. We were sleeping in Saltivka in northeast Kharkiv when a string of explosions went off somewhere nearby in the night. The next morning we went out to see what had actually been hit, walking the dirt roads of that neighborhood, trying to trace the damage back to its source. A woman stopped us. I had a translation app running on my phone, imperfect but good enough, and through it she thanked me for being there. Her name was Tatiana. We asked why she hadn't left, the same question everyone was asking everyone in that part of the city, and her answer was one that I'd hear in different words from dozens of people over the following years. She had nowhere to go, no family to travel to, no money to make the trip even if she had somewhere to land. But underneath the practical reasons was the real one. This was her home. She'd been born in that house. Her parents had been born in that house. She wasn't leaving it. She invited us in for tea. And I want to describe what that house looked like because I think people need to understand what survival actually looks like at 75 years old, alone in a war. 2 rooms of her home had taken damage badly enough that she'd had to move everything she owned into 2 rooms still standing. Belongings stacked everywhere, no real system to it beyond triage. Her bed was gone. She'd built herself a replacement out of whatever was on hand. A wooden chair, a piece of plywood laid across it, propped up milk cartons to hold it level. That was the bed. No padding, just a blanket and a pillow, both soaked through because a Russian artillery shell had landed close enough to tear a hole straight through her roof, and the leak had never stopped. We gave her $400 in cash, the money we had on us that day. Enough, once she found someone local to do the labor, to actually get that roof patched and sealed before the next hard rain. I want you to understand what that meant in real terms. A retiree's pension in Ukraine runs somewhere around $180 a month. People in that situation, they grow their own vegetables because there's no other way to stretch what little comes in. $400 wasn't charity in the abstract sense. It was more than 2 months of income handed to a woman sleeping on a plank because her roof had a hole in it that the state had no capacity to fix. And it was enough in this one case to actually solve the specific problem in front of us. I want to be clear about that because so much of what we did out there was triage, a stopgap against a problem too large to actually finish. This one, we finished. Her roof got fixed. She hugged me more than once, and I have a photo of it. Her arms around me, both of us smiling in a house that was falling apart around us. I think about her constantly. Is she okay? Is she still in that house? Is she still alive? I don't have a clean answer. I want to tell you honestly why. The phone number I could have used to check on her belonged to my translator, not to me. And by the time our working relationship ended, the story I told you a couple chapters back, I had no longer any way to reach her. I never went back to that neighborhood. I don't know if I could even find that house again without him. That not knowing is its own kind of weight I've been carrying since I left Kharkiv. And I've made a kind of peace with the fact that I may never get to close that particular loop. Some of the people you help in a war stay with you exactly like that. Vivid, permanent, and permanently out of reach. I want to tell you something else about that day because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else from this whole war. We didn't normally go out looking for impact craters. It wasn't really part of the mission. Walking out to see where a missile had actually landed the night before felt more like curiosity than work, and we usually didn't have time to spare for it. But that particular morning, we had a gap before our next meeting, so we went. If we hadn't had that hour to kill, we never would have been on that dirt road, and we never would have met Tatiana at all. What struck me most wasn't the roof, or the shattered rooms, or the chair and plywood bed that she'd built out of whatever was on hand. It was how she reacted to us. She kept marveling, out loud in word and in deed, at the fact that an American had simply appeared out of nowhere like something dropped out of the sky and handed her enough money to make her roof livable again. No application, no bureaucracy, no strings. And in return, she gave us everything she had. She had nothing extra. She was a woman sleeping on a board in a bombed-out house, and still, she made us tea. She insisted we eat with her, physically pressed food into our hands, gave us her time and her stories and her gratitude in a form that had nothing to do with money, because money was the only thing that she genuinely didn't have. That's not a story about Tatiana specifically, not really. It's the story of an entire country. Ukrainians can't match American buying power. Nobody's asking them to. What they give instead is everything else. Their food, even when there's barely enough of it. Their time, even when every hour is spent surviving. Their hearts, wide open to strangers who showed up for an hour and then drove away. Diagnose a problem, solve it with $400 of donated money, and watch a woman with almost nothing insist on giving you something back anyway. That's Tatiana, and also in miniature, the whole country of Ukraine. I want to stop the story for one paragraph here because I don't want this to be a chapter you simply feel something about and then turn the page. $400 fixed Tatiana's roof. That's not a metaphor, and that's not a rounding error in a bigger appeal. That's the literal, complete cost of the thing that's happened in this chapter. There is another Tatiana somewhere in Ukraine tonight, sleeping on a board because a roof leaks, who has not yet had the good luck of a stranger walking down her particular dirt road. If this story moved you at all, that feeling has somewhere to go before it fades. I've put the concrete current ways to act on it in the back of this book, and I'd rather you turn there now while you're still feeling what you're feeling than wait until the last page. There's one more story from this period I want to tell you carefully because it touches something in me that goes back further than this war. We helped repair the roof of a state-run orphanage for special needs children in northern Ukraine up near Chernobyl. It survived, like nearly every institution of its kind in this country right now, almost entirely on volunteer donations, because the Ukrainian government simply doesn't have the resources to fund it properly, not while it's pouring everything it has into holding off an army that outnumbers it roughly 3-1, with what looks like an unlimited supply of material and resources in Russia. A former U.S. Army officer, a West Point graduate who has become one of my closest partners out here, drove up with me. We brought supplies, we brought money for repairs, and we spent time with the kids. There was one boy, probably in his late teens, who followed me around the entire visit. I believe he had cerebral palsy, along with some other developmental disabilities. He was also, without question, a gifted artist. His work hung all over that school, and he was visibly enormously proud of it. I took a photo with him that day. He's got the biggest smile I think I've ever seen on another human being's face. I'll be honest with you. I don't know how much that boy understood about the war happening around him. Why supplies were scarce. Why the building he lived in needed volunteers from another country to fix its roof. I'm not qualified to say. Maybe he understood everything. Maybe the war simply wasn't a concept in his mind processed the way ours does. What I do know is that in the hour that I spent with him, none of that mattered. He was happy, genuinely, completely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with geopolitics and everything to do with a stranger sitting down next to him and looking at his drawings like they mattered. Because they did. I have a particular reason that moment hit me the way it did. I came from an orphanage myself. I was adopted out of Korea at 8 months old, and in the early 1980s, something like 15% of Korean orphans in my situations ever got adopted at all, let alone into a family in the United States. I was one of the lucky ones, twice over. So kids growing up inside institutional walls without the version of childhood most people take for granted have always occupied a particular place in my heart long before I ever set foot in Ukraine. Whatever that boy did or didn't understand about the war outside his walls, the joy on his face that afternoon is the thing I'd wish for every kid living through this, understanding it or not. Chapter 13. What Modern War Looks Like. You have to start with a shortage, because that shortage explains everything else about how this war is actually being fought. Ukraine has never had enough artillery shells, not close to enough, not for the scale of the front they're defending, because the free world hasn't supplied them at the volume the fight requires. This is, at its core, an artillery war, fought from trenches along a line that stretches hundreds of miles, about the distance from New York to Dallas, the way wars were fought a century ago. But when you don't have enough of the shells that this kind of war runs on, you fight with whatever you can build instead. And what Ukraine has built out of necessity is a drone war, unlike anything the world has seen at this scale before. They call the attack drones FPVs, first-person view, a soldier flying a small aircraft with an explosive charge strapped to it, guiding it in by live video feeds until it detonates on target. I don't think most Americans have really absorbed what that means for the man on the ground. I've come to think of it as its own particular kind of fear, related to, but distinct from what soldiers have described in other wars. The Vietnam infantryman, never sure if the next tree line held an ambush. The Iraq or Afghanistan driver, never sure if the next rotation of his tires would find a buried IED. In eastern Ukraine, it's the buzz. You're holding a position in a field or town and you hear it. The drone's small engine, the rotors, the drone moving at something like 100 miles an hour, camera live, explosive attached, and you understand in that instant that a machine smarter and faster than your own instincts might already be hunting you specifically. And there's very little you can do about it if it's found you. And it's not only explosive kamikaze drones. There are munitions out there using white phosphorus. The Russians use these, and white phosphorus burns at a temperature that will melt through skin to the bone if it reaches you. But it won't burn through a few inches of packed dirt. So soldiers sleep under tarps with dirt piled on top of them, an ancient-feeling defense against a very modern weapon. Because sometimes the only thing standing between a man and something that catastrophic is a few inches of soil. Drones have effectively replaced the sky that used to belong to fighter jets, bombers, and manned reconnaissance aircraft. Over the eastern part of the country, the air is thick with them, some flying on fiber optic control lines specifically because those lines can't be jammed electronically, which is why you'll see photographs of Ukrainian towns strung with visible fiber optic cable running for miles. A strange, almost science fiction texture laid over an otherwise ordinary landscape. There are drones built for the ground now too. This is, as plainly as I can put it, the first real robot war on Earth, and it's happening in fields and tree lines most Americans couldn't find on a map. The only reason Ukraine is holding a numerically and materially superior army back at all right now is drones. And a meaningful share of those drones exist because volunteers from outside the country helped pay for them. I've met people from 25 different countries out here doing this work in Ukraine. We're not funding weapons of offense. The supply lines that we fund, they fund the non-lethal side. Reconnaissance drones that let a unit see danger coming before it arrives. Medical evacuation drones that can reach a wounded man in places no vehicle or helicopter can safely go. The tourniquets and vehicles and supplies that keep him alive until help arrives. I've heard stories firsthand from combat medics holding hillside positions under fire in eastern Ukraine. 19-year-old kids who were video editors and waiters and cab drivers a few years ago, now functioning as combat medics themselves, keeping other men alive under fire because someone had to learn how, and they were the ones available. I don't have a single cinematic story of individual valor to hand you here, the kind of clean, complete narrative of heroism you could find with a quick search online. What I have instead is something I think matters more. The story of an entire society, all of it restructuring itself around survival. 36 million people still inside the country. 5 to 8 million people more who had to leave and haven't come back, all of them oriented toward the same goal. Ukraine is likely to field something like 7 million drones this year, most of which will be shot down or destroyed before they ever complete a mission. And that attrition rate is exactly why the number needs to be 7 million in the first place. If there's a single image that captures what this actually looks like at the family level, it's this. An 8-year-old kid ordering individual components off Alibaba or Amazon, assembling a drone on his kitchen table with a 3D printer and handing it to his brother, his uncle, his grandfather, headed back to the front. Because without that drone, that relative won't see danger coming in time. Ukraine's own defense ministry has promoted and distributed plans for exactly this kind of home assembly to households across the country. And millions of these drones have been built that way, in kitchens, by people with no military background, because everyone understood there was no other way to make the numbers work. That's the story I actually want you to take from this chapter, more than the fear or the fire. It's not a story about one hero. It's a story about an entire population, people working their paid jobs by day and then showing up as volunteer engineers, seamstresses, sewing camouflage netting, fundraisers, repairing vehicles, all of it unpaid, all of it on top of an already full week. Because everyone in this country made the same calculation at roughly the same time, that no single person's sacrifice would be enough, and every person's sacrifice together might be. I believe that's the lesson worth bringing home, not the drones themselves, not the phosphorus, not the fear. The fact that 36 million people found a way to set aside whatever normally divides a society and pointed everything they had at the same target. That is, I'd argue, the purest distillation of what an entire country choosing to work together actually looks like. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's happening in the one country on earth right now most acutely reminded every single day of what it costs to lose the freedom to choose anything at all. Chapter 14. What nobody tells you. I have to tell you something before I go any further. I want to be honest about why it's taken me 13 chapters to say it. I don't think it's my story to complain about. I was raised somewhere that if you're doing service work, an hour at the food pantry, a shift at the homeless shelter, a weekend with the Veterans Organization, you don't talk about what it's costing you. That's not humility exactly. It's more like a rule that nobody ever states out loud. The sacrifice belongs to the person you're serving, not to you. And the moment you start narrating your own cost, you've made the story about yourself instead of about them. I've lived by that rule for 4.5 years. I've done probably 200 interviews from inside Ukraine, and I don't think I've ever once been asked or asked myself out loud what any of this actually took from me. But you and I are trying to tell the whole truth in this book, and I've come to think that leaving this part out is its own kind of dishonesty. The kind where the reader walks away thinking courage is free, or that conviction alone is what it takes, and never sees the ledger underneath it. So here's the ledger. The money. Before the invasion, I was a Fortune 500 motivational speaker and national touring performer. The guy the NFL hands a microphone to for the anthem, 21 games worth of it over 10 years, singing in front of something like 100 million people on television across my career. I was booking corporate keynotes anywhere from a few $1,000s an hour up toward $25,000 an hour, sometimes more for international travel, and I was consistently in the top 1% of earners for my age group in America. I built that from nothing with a business partner over a decade out of Fargo, North Dakota. I was semi-retired by my early 30s, working maybe 80 days a year and living well the rest of the time, which is about as close as any American from a farm town in Minnesota gets to actually winning the game the country tells you to play. I've given that up. Not all of it. I mean, I still fly home a handful of times a year and do a paid engagement or two to keep the lights on, but the trajectory is gone. If I'd kept building my business instead of coming here, I believe I'd be well past $1 million a year in income by now. On national television regularly, sitting at head tables I used to sit at with Fortune 500 CEOs and senior executives, a track I'd already put 10 years of work into before I had ever heard of Bucha or Kharkiv. I've missed something well over $1 million in earnings by this point, by my own rough accounting, and I'm not exaggerating the number to make a point. If anything, I think it's conservative. Here's the part that's harder to say. I don't have money anymore. There were months before all this where I'd look at my checking account and see 5 figures there without much thought. For a kid who grew up working on a farm in the 90s, that used to feel like a small miracle every time I'd open my bank account. These days, when a soldier I know messages me asking for help for repairing a vehicle, Sometimes all I can send is $50 because $50 is all that's left. I've told the news crew on camera that I'm broke, and I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because I think people assume a person doing this kind of work at this kind of scale must have significant resources behind him. And the truth is closer to the opposite. I've spent down what I built over a decade. Out of the 4.5 years I've been doing this, only about 6 months of my own living expenses have ever been covered by a couple of nonprofits that hired me for consulting work along the way. The other 4 years, give or take, I've covered myself out of savings that no longer exist. The relationships. I lived in a town where I knew people. Thousands of people knew my name and tens of thousands knew my face from a decade of singing at their games and speaking at their schools and companies. I had real friends there, close ones. Today, I'm down to 3 or 4 people back in the States that I talk to with any real regularity, plus my mother and my sister. Everyone else has quietly fallen away the way relationships do when one person's entire life reorganizes itself around a war zone 8 time zones away and stops being reachable in the ordinary rhythms that keep a friendship alive. Some of that is just physics. You cannot maintain the same closeness with someone when you're 3 miles away from a front line, trying to get a truck full of tourniquets to a farmhouse, and they're back at a barbecue back home. And neither of those facts is anyone's fault. But some of it isn't physics. There are people who told me directly to my face before I left, "I've got your back. Whatever you need, I'm here for you." And then, when I actually needed something small and simple from them while I was out here in Ukraine, those people didn't show up. I have a rule about that now. If you tell a friend heading into a war zone as a volunteer that you're going to be there for him and then you aren't, I don't have room in my life to keep that relationship going. And I mean that as a statement of principle, not bitterness. So yes, my relationships have suffered. Some of that loss I mourn. Some of it honestly told me something true about who was actually in my corner, and I don't regret knowing it. The freedom, ironically. I've thought about this a lot because I think it's the least obvious cost and maybe the most honest one. You see, military service doesn't give you freedom. Let me say that again. Military service doesn't give the military member freedom. It asks you to give some of yours up on purpose so that other people get to keep more of theirs. You follow orders in the military. You go where you're sent. That's not incidental to service. It's the actual shape of the sacrifice. I signed up for that once for 6 years in an Air Force uniform. I've been signed up for it, a version of that again for 4.5 years now. Not under anyone's orders this time, entirely by my own choice, which somehow doesn't make it feel any less like a surrender of the freedom I could otherwise spend living however I wanted. That's the trade every one of the 20,000 American volunteers out here has made, whether we say it out loud or not. Less freedom for ourselves on purpose, so that people we've never met might get to keep theirs. And the part I almost didn't write. I want to tell you honestly what this work actually feels like most days, because the version people see, the photos of people posing by the aid that they're delivering, the interviews, the supply convoys, it isn't the whole picture. This work, it's maddening. It is demoralizing in a way that I don't think is fully understood until I lived inside of it. See, you'll have $50,000 of legitimate, urgent, verified need in front of you. Boots, cold weather gear, batteries, $30 tourniquets, laptops, camouflage netting, the most basic, unglamorous equipment you can imagine. These things that soldiers won't get if a volunteer doesn't personally go buy them and deliver them. And you'll have $5,000 to meet it with. You'll have 500 guys in your phone asking, people that you know and respect, men whose names you know, asking for that same $50,000 list, and you'll have $38 in your account. There is a specific grinding kind of exhaustion that comes from doing that math over and over for years and never once getting to solve it cleanly. 99 days out of 100, none of this. The money, the relationships, the freedom I gave up, the exhaustion. outweighs the fact that I found something that mattered to me more than the version of my life I was building before. And I want to be honest about that too, because I don't want you to read this chapter as regret dressed up as honesty. It isn't. But I think a reader deserves to know that the choice cost something real, measured in real dollars and real friendships and real nights, lying awake doing math that never comes out even. And that I made it anyway, with my eyes open, over and over for 4.5 years. That's the actual sacrifice, not the danger. The danger most nights was manageable. The actual sacrifice was everything I just told you, repeated quietly without an audience for 1,642 days and counting. I want to say one more thing before I close this chapter, because I don't want you to read any of it as a story about how much I specifically gave up. Every single one of the 20,000 American volunteers and the hundreds of thousands of allied volunteers from European countries in the free world who have done this work for any real stretch of time has a version of this same ledger. Every one of us has spent down savings we won't easily rebuild. Every one of us has watched friendships thin out because we stopped being reachable in the ordinary ways. That's not me being unusually generous or unusually brave. It's just what happens to a person over and over when they find a cause that needs resources they control more than they need them for themselves. I'm not the one this book should make you admire. I'm not special, and neither is anyone else doing this work. Ukraine is special. We just happen to be in a position to notice it before most people did. Chapter 15, The Greatest Generation 2.0. If I trace this whole thing back far enough, past February 24th of 2022, past the campaign, past common sense on my kitchen table, I land on my father, Gordon Lindquist. He was raised by the greatest generation, born into a household shaped by people who'd lived through the Depression and fought a world war, and he came of age himself during Vietnam. He chose to serve, not in uniform, but in the Peace Corps, sent to a village in Malaysia to teach farming to the people who needed it. He came from the single greatest agricultural power the world has ever known, the United States of America, a farm kid himself with an agriculture degree from the University of Minnesota, and he took what he knew about soil and yield and put it to work on the other side of the planet for people who owed him nothing, and he owed nothing too. He did it, as I understand now, for a reason bigger than adventure. To show the Lindquist family, to show his own future son and daughter, even before we existed, what it meant to serve, to volunteer, to leave the world a little better than you found it, and then to come home and keep doing that. He never sat me down and delivered that lesson in words. He didn't have to. I've seen the photographs of the students he taught in those Malaysian schools. Years later, once Facebook existed, some of those same students found him again and wrote to him, grown adults, reaching back across decades to thank the American teacher who'd shown up once and mattered. That's not a lecture, that's a life, lived in a certain way, doing the teaching on its own. I think that's the actual inheritance I carry into this work. My life is meant to function as an example, proof, the same way that man on the BBC was proof to me, that ordinary people can choose to do something that matters. That's the entire theory behind partnering with thousands of American donors instead of trying to do this alone. It creates a one-to-one visible chain between a household with a little extra and a Ukrainian soldier now holding a $30 tourniquet that exists because someone back home in America decided that their extra could travel 5,000 miles across an ocean to the eastern edge of the free world and mean something big. That chain is the lesson, not the tourniquet itself. The fact that an ordinary act of giving multiplied by thousands of ordinary people adds to something none of them could do alone. My father's example didn't stop with him. My sister and I both served in Key Club in high school, the youth branch of Kiwanis, and I went on to found a Circle K chapter in college, the collegiate version of the same organization. I've been a Kiwanis member, I've been a Rotarian, I've been a Lions Club member, Disabled Americans Veteran member, American Legion member, member of the VFW. I want to tell you about one specific moment inside those Key Club years, because I think it's the closest thing I have to an origin point for everything that came after. When I was 17, I was invited to Washington, D.C. for something called the Prudential Spirit of Community Awards, a national recognition program for youth volunteerism. My parents, Gordon and Diane, they got to come with me. It was May of 1999. Magic Johnson was the keynote speaker that year. And I remember almost nothing else from that whole conference except one sentence that he said in front of our audience of youth volunteers. And I've been repeating it to myself for 27 years since. He said, "A life well lived is a life spent giving back to those who have given so much to you." He talked that day about reinvesting what he had earned as an NBA star back into the inner city communities that had shaped him, communities that, in his experience, the rest of the country had mostly written off. I have a photograph from that day, a 17-year-old kid standing next to Magic Johnson, having no idea the sentence he'd just heard would end up shaping and describing the entirety of his adult life. I want to tell you why that sentence resonated so specifically once I got to Ukraine, because I don't think it's obvious on its face. Magic was talking about giving back to a community that had literally raised him, the neighborhoods, the coaches, the people who'd shaped him directly. Ukraine never did that for me. I'd never set foot in Ukraine before 2022. I didn't know a single Ukrainian. Nothing about Ukraine had given me anything, personally, in the way Magic's communities had given to him. But the cause of freedom had. The cause of freedom had given me great things in my life. I'd built an entire adult life, a business, a career, a level of security most people never reach, inside a country that only exists because other people in other generations decided freedom was worth defending. I didn't earn the right to be born in the United States any more than I earned the right to be adopted into a family that gave me every opportunity I've ever had. Freedom had given me everything long before I ever thought to ask what I owed it back. So when I finally understood why Magic's sentence had stayed with me for 27 years, I realized that I'd quietly been rewriting it in my head the whole time without meaning to. Now it is, "A life well lived is a life spent giving back to the cause of freedom that has given so much to me." That's the actual sentence I carried on that plane to Poland. That's the sentence that I've carried on my supply runs out to eastern Ukraine. I just hadn't said it out loud until now. That lesson kept compounding. After high school, I deferred a music scholarship to Concordia College to join AmeriCorps NCCC, the National Civilian Community Corps, based on the CCC of the 1930s. AmeriCorps, sometimes called the Domestic Peace Corps, a small, intensive national service program that's been quietly running for over 30 years. What we would do is 10 or 12 of us at a time, sent wherever the need was that month, building a Habitat for Humanity house for a family in Franklin, West Virginia, clearing trails alongside the National Park Service so hikers could use the land, certifying as a Type 2 wildland firefighter, carrying the actual red card and a Pulaski in my hand, holding fire lines in the Appalachians so wildfire didn't take a family's home with it, responding with the American Red Cross to Tropical Storm Allison in Houston, to Ground Zero at the Pentagon after September 11th, to tornado damage in Maryland. I learned at 19 and 20 years old in AmeriCorps exactly what it feels like to show up in a community that's just been hit by something enormous and say, simply, "We're here to help." And then to watch 10 ordinary people working toward the same goal with no special resources beyond their own hands, I got to see what could actually get done. And then it was the Air Force. 6 years active duty, sworn in as a volunteer to an all-volunteer force, which is its own kind of service most Americans don't think much about. Nobody drafted me. I chose it. I wasn't the best airman who ever wore that uniform, not even close. I mean, I know that. But I gave everything I had for 6 years, and I kept giving in smaller ways since, flying myself on my own money and my own dime, to sing the national anthem at NFL games over a decade. I don't get paid for that. That's a volunteer gig because I believe a country needs its moments of shared unity, and I happen to be one of the people who the league, the NFL, trusts with a microphone to provide that moment of unity. I served in the AmeriCorps that builds habitat homes and holds wildfire lines. I served in the Air Force, and now I'm serving in Ukraine. It's just the same thread, just extended further than my father ever traveled it himself, but it was his example that started it all. And it's further, honestly, than I expected to travel it myself, back when I was standing next to Magic Johnson, having no idea what that one sentence was about to cost me or give me over the following 27 years. And here's why I think this matters for anyone reading this who isn't planning to get on a plane. We are, I believe, living through a period where most people have quietly concluded that the world's problems are simply too large for one person to touch. And so, understandably, if you follow that logic all the way through, people do nothing. Not out of cruelty, out of a kind of learned helplessness about scale. A problem that feels unsolvable by a single person eventually just becomes background noise, something to be mildly upset about and then scroll past. But the generation my father was raised by didn't solve big problems as isolated individuals. They solved them through organizations, built specifically to make an unsolvable feeling problem solvable. Kiwanis, Lions, Rotary, Optimist, Sertoma, the American Legion, the VFW, rooms full of ordinary people meeting on a Tuesday at noon, pooling what they had and moving a problem that no one of them could have moved alone. I think we've lost a lot of that instinct in the decades since, and I think we're worse for it. Not because people got worse, but because the structures that turned individual concern into collective action stopped getting rebuilt for each new generation. Ukraine, to me, is the clearest opportunity in my lifetime to rebuild that instinct and hand it to the next generation intact. It's a cause that doesn't require anyone to invent new values. It simply asks Americans to apply the values we already claim to hold, the ones my father tried to live out in a Malaysian village 60 years ago, the ones the greatest generation organized their whole civic life around. Different war, different decade. Same question every generation eventually has to answer for itself. When something bigger than you needs doing, do you find your organization, find your people, and go do your part? Or do you decide it's too big and do nothing? Chapter 16. Who leads the free world now? I want to ask you a question, and I want you to actually sit with it before you move to the next paragraph. What do you want America to be? Not what it is right now, in the noise of the daily news cycle. What you want it to be. The shape of a country begins, before anything else, in the minds of its citizens. That's the whole premise the founders were operating on when they sat down to write it into existence in the first place. That power was handed to us, generation after generation, by people who believed self-government was worth the risk of trying. Every generation, including this one, including you reading this right now, gets to decide what course to chart next. What does America look like in the next 250 years? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the actual question in front of us. I'm going to speak in a bigger language for a few pages because I think this particular moment calls for it. And because we've grown embarrassed as a culture of saying things plainly that used to be said proudly. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are unalienable rights. That's not decoration. The founders meant it. And it's worth remembering what it actually asks of a free citizen. Not just to enjoy those rights, but to understand what it costs to keep them and who's currently paying that cost on our behalf. You are part of roughly 4% of the world's population that holds American citizenship, and part of the wider 20% that gets to live anywhere in the free world at all. Most of us were born into that inheritance without ever lifting a finger to earn it. The same way, not incidentally, that a Ukrainian citizen was born into their circumstances without choosing them either. We happen to be born behind two oceans, under the protection of the most capable military the world has ever built. If we take that military seriously, I think we also have to take seriously the allies who now stand alongside it. Because the United States no longer holds the position it once did, unchallenged at the front of that formation. Here's the claim I want to put in front of you plainly. If you asked me today, in 2026, to choose which soldier I'd trust with my life on the modern battlefield, American or Ukrainian, I would choose the Ukrainian every single time, and it's not even close. That's not an insult to the American serviceman or servicewoman whose training, discipline, and courage I know firsthand from 6 years in this country's uniform. It's a statement about experience. The Ukrainian military has spent 4.5 years fighting and refining the first true drone war in human history, in real time against a numerically superior enemy, with battlefield lessons being rewritten weekly. No other military on Earth currently holds that specific hard-won expertise, at least not in the free world's militaries. That should land as something close to a gut punch for the average American, because it means the country that has long called itself the leader of the free world's defense is in this one critical and rapidly growing domain now the student rather than the teacher. And that matters far beyond Ukraine's own borders. Every generation of military planners tends to make the same mistake, preparing to fight the last war instead of the next one. The next major conflict the United States finds itself in the Taiwan Strait, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, or somewhere none of us are currently watching, is far more likely to be shaped by drone warfare than by anything our doctrine was built around a decade ago. Every Ukrainian soldier who dies today carries knowledge in his head that could have kept an American service member alive tomorrow, and that knowledge dies with him unless we make a deliberate choice to capture it first. I say this as a veteran with no official title, no defense credential beyond an intelligence background from years ago, and a great deal of time spent since actually on the ground in this specific war. I brief members of Congress and their staff on Ukraine through RASM, an advocacy organization I work with in Washington. I sit with senators and congressmen and low-level staffers and senior ones alike because people in that building have come to treat me as a credible civilian source on what's actually happening in Ukraine. And I'll tell you what I plainly tell them. Ukraine's military is as prepared for this specific kind of warfare as any on Earth right now, more prepared in this one narrow but critical domain than our own. And we should be listening to them as instructors, not just supplying them as a client state. I would advocate for a formal training partnership run through the Department of Defense, investing on the order of $20 to $30 billion a year specifically to embed Ukrainian combat experience into American military training. I want Ukrainians to teach us. I think that's genuinely an uncomfortable sentence for a lot of American military planners to read. And I think discomfort is exactly the right response, because it's true. We are living in a moment where the United States, by word, by action, and by simple comparison, is no longer unambiguously the leader of the free world. If we want that title back, wanting it isn't enough. It has to be earned again, through action, the same way it was earned the first time. And that starts with an honest answer to the question I opened this chapter with. What do you actually want America to be? I'll give you my own answer, since I don't think it's fair to ask a question of you without answering it myself. I want America to be the leader of the free world again. Not in name, not in the way we still describe ourselves out of habit, but in demonstrated fact. I don't believe our United States government is currently showing the world what that leadership looks like. I believe the reserve of potential to actually earn it back sits somewhere else entirely. In the society, in we the people, in the volunteerism, the giving, the plain willingness of ordinary Americans to care about the free world beyond our own borders, if only someone would ask them to and show them how. I want America to be a shining city on a hill again, not as a slogan, but as a place where people understand in their bones what it costs the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to actually earn that breath. I want us to be a people who take the duty of citizenship in the free world seriously enough to act on it, not just recite from memory the way you'd recite something you learned once and never tested. Previous generation of Americans answered the call when freedom's cause came knocking. I want to be a part of that generation that still knows how. Whatever your own answer is, it isn't going to build itself. It never has. Chapter 17. The Cause of All Mankind. I want to bring you back to where this whole story started. A one-bedroom apartment in Moorhead, Minnesota, across the river from Fargo, North Dakota, in February of 2022. A copy of Thomas Paine's Common Sense open on the table, and a line that wouldn't let me go. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Paine wrote that in February of 1776, 246 years before I read it that week. He wasn't writing about foreign policy. He was making an argument about why free people have both the right and obligation to govern themselves. That the American experiment, if it succeeded, wouldn't just be a good outcome for 13 colonies, it would be proof available to the rest of humanity that self-government was actually possible. That the divine right of kings wasn't the only available answer to the question of how human beings should be ruled. America's cause, in his telling, was never really a local cause. It was a demonstration offered to the whole world of what free people could build if they were given the chance. I've spent 4.5 years now watching the same demonstration play out again on a different stretch of ground under a different flag. Ukraine's fight isn't a regional border dispute any more than the American Revolution was a regional tax dispute. At its core, it's the same question Paine was asking in 1776. Does a people get to determine its own government, its own future, its own identity? Or does that get decided for them by whoever has the largest army standing at their border? Ukraine answered that question the same way the colonies did. They said no. We choose for ourselves. That's why I believe the line applies just as directly today as it did then, with one word change. The cause of Ukraine is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Not because Ukraine is America, not because their history is our history, it isn't. And I've tried to tell enough of their specific particular story in this book to make that clear. But the underlying question is identical. And the founders themselves seem to understand that the American cause was never meant to stay contained inside of American borders. Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Hamilton, the letters between them return again and again to the idea that what they were building was an example for the world, not a private arrangement for themselves. Watching another people fight the same fight for the same reasons in our lifetime and deciding it's simply not our concern is a much harder position to defend than most of us want to admit. I think about the rights of man that Paine wrote about, and the language in our own Declaration, that all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I don't believe our founders meant that clause to apply to only people who happen to be born inside of a particular set of borders. I believe they meant it as a claim about human beings, full stop, and that every generation of Americans since has had to decide for itself whether it actually believes that claim or just recites it. This generation's version of that test happens to be playing out in the Donbass, in Kharkiv, in a kitchen in Kyiv where an 8-year-old is 3D printing a drone housing for his grandfather. Standing with the people answering that test, the way our own fathers answered it centuries ago, is not a departure from American values. It's the most direct possible expression of them. Chapter 18, The Capital of Freedom. A while back, CBS Saturday Morning sent a correspondent named Holly Williams to interview me in the center of Kyiv. And one moment from that conversation has stuck with me longer than almost anything else I've said on camera in 4.5 years. We were walking through Independence Square, Maidan Nezalazny, the same square where Ukraine's 2014 revolution played out, where people died fighting for the right to choose their own alignment with Europe instead of Moscow. I called it in that interview the capital of freedom. I want to explain what I meant by that because I've thought a lot about it since. If you tried to define, literally, what a capital of freedom would be, I think you'd land somewhere like this. The place where freedom currently shines brightest under the most direct pressure to extinguish it. Not a monument to freedom, a live demonstration of it, still being fought for in real time, where you can watch exactly what it costs to keep. That's Kyiv right now. You learn something standing in that square that you can't learn from a textbook or a museum. You learn it by watching people choose daily at real cost to keep being free. Holly asked me a question while we walked that I think every American reading this book should ask themselves. Why should Americans care about Ukraine? I've been trying to answer that question for 4.5 years in one form or another, and here's the fullest version I've got. Ukraine is a reflection of America. Not a copy, not a client state, but a mirror held up to the same basic idea that citizens who organize themselves can build something no king, no czar, no strongman could ever build for them. That idea isn't uniquely American, and it never was. In 1710, a Ukrainian Cossack leader named Philip Orlik wrote a constitution, a real formal document expressing and establishing separation of powers and the rights of citizens 66 years before our own Declaration of Independence. I don't say that to diminish what our founders did. I say it because it matters. The hunger for self-government, for a government that answers to its people instead of ruling over them, isn't an American invention. It's a human one. And different peoples have reached for it independently in different centuries whenever the conditions allowed for it. I want to tell you about something that happened on May 28th of 2026 on Kharkiv, the main street running through the heart of Kyiv, the capital of freedom, right in front of the mayor's office. I wanted to put on another morale concert, the same instinct that led to the bunker in Kharkiv years earlier. So I reached out to the deputy mayor's office directly through some great Ukrainian contacts that I have, and I asked directly for permission to stand on that street in front of the mayor's office in a tuxedo with a microphone and sing Sinatra for whoever wanted to stop and listen. Within 4 days, I had it in writing, official approval from a foreign government to exercise in public, in the middle of a war, something that looks an awful lot like the freedom of speech and expression our own Constitution promises us at home. Freedom of assembly, those same cherished American values on display in the capital of freedom on May 28th of 2026. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think it's the most quietly radical thing in this entire book. An American citizen, a foreigner with no formal standing, no diplomatic title, asked a Ukrainian city government for permission to publicly perform and got a clear, fast, written yes. I don't know how long the same request would take to clear at a city, state, or federal level back home in America, and I suspect a lot of you don't either. I'm not saying that to criticize America. I'm saying it because I think it's important for you to know that the values we hold up as uniquely ours, free expression, a government that says yes to its citizens quickly instead of burying them in process, these values are alive in Ukraine right now. In at least this one small specific way, they're working there better and faster than they often do in America. That's not a criticism of Ukraine's fitness to hold the values, it's opposite. It's proof the values themselves don't need to live inside American borders to be real. I didn't perform there on Kharkiv only for the Ukrainians. It was just as much for you, for the American reading this or watching this video later, wondering whether Ukraine's government is something worth their trust. I wanted proof on camera that an ordinary citizen of the free world could ask a Ukrainian government office for permission to publicly exercise free expression, freedom of assembly, and get a clear, fast yes. We put a concert on. It went on social media on different people's platforms. A foreigner in a tuxedo singing an American songbook on a Ukrainian street to the capital of freedom with the local government's written blessing to perform on the steps of the mayor's office in Kyiv in the middle of the largest war in Europe since 1945. I think that's the real answer to Holly's question. You should care about Ukraine because it's currently running the experiment our founders started, under fire, in real time, with the outcome genuinely undecided. And because a society running that experiment successfully right now deserves the same thing an earlier generation of Americans once needed from people who weren't obligated to give it: the belief that their fight was worth someone's help. Chapter 19. What it would cost, what it's worth. I want to talk plainly about money now, because I think vague appeals to conscience without real numbers attached are how good causes get ignored. Roughly a third of Ukraine's economy is currently dedicated to its own defense, a staggering redirection of a nation's entire productive capacity toward simply staying alive. And even with that, by my own read of the situation from years on the ground, their defense industry is operating at somewhere around a quarter to a third of what its actual manufacturing capacity could produce if the money existed to fund it. That's not a lack of will, or a lack of engineering talent, or a lack of factories. It's a lack of capital. I believe the single most consequential thing the free world could do for Ukraine right now isn't more speeches. It's closing that gap. I've walked into hundreds of these defense factories myself over 4.5 years. I want you to picture what I actually mean by that, because I don't think most Americans have the right image in their heads. When you hear defense industry in America, you picture Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Anduril. Companies with multi-billion-dollar government contracts, publicly traded, backed by decades of guaranteed federal spending. Ukraine's equivalents of those companies, the ones building observation drones, the supply drones, the ground robots that evacuate wounded men and deliver food and medical supplies to positions too dangerous for a human being to reach, are, in large part, charity-funded. Not government contracted in the way we understand that term, funded by donations, the same kind of donations this book has been describing the whole way through, just scaled up to the industrial level. These are serious, sophisticated manufacturing operations, doing work that would make any American defense contractor's engineers take notice. And they cannot plan quarter to quarter the way a normal company can, because their funding arrives sporadically, unpredictably, at the mercy of whatever the charitable pipeline happens to produce that month. Here's the number that I think actually explains the shape of this war. My best estimate from years of watching this up close is that it takes something like $60 to $70 billion a year to hold the current front line where it is. With that amount, Ukraine has held back the second largest military on earth. On the other side of that line, Russia is spending somewhere in the range of $100 to $150 billion a year, backed by oil and gas contracts with China and India and Iran, and material support from North Korea, resources that, as far as I can tell, are functionally unlimited compared to what Ukraine has access to. If we fully funded the $100 billion figure I'm describing in this chapter, my biggest dream for what could actually change on this battlefield and what could change for Ukraine, I believe, though I can't promise, that we would start to see that imbalance shift. Supply lines win wars. Ukraine's defense manufacturing capacity has real room to grow. What it doesn't have is the steady, predictable capital that would let it grow into that capacity instead of just surviving month to month. I want to say one more thing plainly, because I think it's easy to lose sight of. Ukraine does not have the money to close this gap itself. This isn't a country with slack in its household budgets. A typical Ukrainian monthly income runs somewhere around $600 to $800 a month. Nowhere near enough to leave room for the kind of discretionary giving that fuels a domestic war bonds campaign. In 2022, Ukraine's economy contracted at a rate comparable to America's Great Depression, and it has never fully recovered. So when I ask you later in this book to consider $177.60 a month, I want you to understand exactly what that ask actually is. It has to come from your monthly budget, not theirs, because theirs simply isn't there. You are the rear support of the free world in this fight in the most literal sense, not an expression, an actual economic fact. What you choose to do with your own surplus is a statement, whether you say anything out loud about it or not, about where your values actually sit. I've seen estimates and done my own rough math from years of watching what these things actually cost on the ground, that fully outfitting Ukraine's homegrown war machine, funding it at the scale its own factories are capable of running at, would take somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion a year. That's a number large enough to sound abstract, so let me put it against something concrete. It's roughly a tenth of what the annual U.S. defense budget is. During the Second World War, American citizens purchased roughly $182 billion in war bonds. That's north of $3 trillion in today's dollars, to fund an existential fight on the other side of two oceans because that generation understood the fight, however far away, was still theirs. I want to put $100 billion against a few more numbers because I think context matters more than the figure itself. Americans spend roughly $105 billion on lottery tickets in a single recent year. Money handed over for odds worse than 1 in 100 million, for the most part, with almost nothing to show for it afterward. We legally wagered close to $167 billion on sports betting in a single year. Total American holiday spending, gifts, decorations, food, all of it, approached $1 trillion in a recent holiday season alone. And the subscription economy in North America, streaming services, apps, meal kits, the things that quietly renew on our credit cards every month, whether we use them or not, is worth something like $235 billion a year. I'm not telling you any of that to shame anyone for how they spend their own money. That's not my business, and that's not the point of this book. I'm telling you because I think $100 billion for Ukraine, once you set it next to numbers we already spend without a second thought on things that build nothing and outlast nothing, stops sounding like an impossible request and starts sounding like a question of priorities. I don't want to leave that $100 billion figure floating without something to measure it against, so here's a real number, not an estimate. United 24, the official fundraising platform launched by the Ukrainian government itself, has publicly reported raising more than $3.7 billion since it began. That's one platform, one channel, entirely voluntarily, with a public running total anyone can check for themselves. Add to that volunteer networks like mine, the $15 million I've personally helped to move, multiplied by thousands of others doing versions of this same work, plus the wider universe of NGOs and charitable organizations operating in and around Ukraine. And I believe $4 to $5 billion is a conservative, defensible estimate of what private and quasi-governmental giving has already accomplished, entirely outside of official state-to-state military aid. I think that number should reframe the rest of this chapter for you. If 4 to 5 billion has already moved through channels built almost entirely on word of mouth and individual conscience, 100 billion isn't a fantasy. It's a scale up of something already proven to work, not an invention of something new. I don't think what I'm proposing needs to run through Washington at all, and in some ways I think it's better if it doesn't. For 4.5 years, thousands of American and allied volunteers, hundreds of thousands of us in total, have built exactly this kind of private channel already. Nonprofits, 501c3 structures, direct donations moving through PayPal and bank transfers, all of it legal, all of it transparent, all of it converting an ordinary American's surplus into a tourniquet, a drone, a vehicle, delivered by hand to the people who need it. I believe that infrastructure could be scaled dramatically if enough Americans decided to fund it. My own rough estimate is that the private volunteer supply line network, the version of this work I've spent years building, could responsibly handle something on the order of $20 billion a year if the donations existed to support it. The remainder would need to reach Ukraine's own defense manufacturing directly through whatever legal financial channels can be built or expanded to carry it. I want you to understand exactly how precise this system already is, because I think it's the strongest evidence I have that this kind of scale is achievable without waste. This isn't guesswork on my end. I have received official military letters of request, signed, stamped, and issued by commanders, specifying the exact make, model, and serial number and quantity of what a unit needs. Not just medical supplies generically. They'll list a specific tourniquet by brand because that's the one their own medics trust with a man's life. Not a drone generically, a specific chassis, a specific payload configuration, because that's what fits the mission they're actually running. These commanders, they don't have unlimited time. They don't hand a stranger that level of specificity unless they trust it will actually be acted upon. That's what 4.5 years of showing up consistently actually buys you. Precision. And precision is exactly what makes a private 20,000 person supply network capable of moving $20 billion without waste that plagues larger, more bureaucratic channels. Because every dollar has a name, a model number, and a soldier attached to it before it's ever spent. I want to name something plainly here because I think we take it for granted to the point of forgetting it's true. An American in the 1940s who cared about a fight for freedom on the other side of the planet had almost no way to act on that conviction directly. They could vote, write a letter, maybe send a check through an organization that took weeks to move it. Their government was effectively the only channel available to them. You do not live in that world. You are holding a device that can move money to a verified organization in Ukraine in under a minute, video call a volunteer on the ground to ask exactly where that money is going, and find and organize 10 other people who feel the same way you do, all before you finish your morning coffee. That's not a minor convenience. It's a genuinely new capability in human history, and I think it'd be a real shame, a waste of something no earlier generations of Americans ever had, if we didn't use it for something that actually matters while we have it. I want to be honest about something here because I think honesty is what makes an argument like this worth trusting. I can't promise you a specific military outcome in exchange for a specific dollar figure. I'm not going to tell you that $100 billion buys a guaranteed return to any particular border. War doesn't work on guarantees, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What I can tell you from years of watching exactly how efficiently an American dollar gets turned into a working drone, a repaired vehicle, or a soldier who survives a wound that would have killed him without a tourniquet, is that this is about as well documented and direct use of donated money that I've ever personally witnessed. I believe it's worth your investment. Consider what $14 trillion sitting in American household savings and brokerage accounts actually represents against that backdrop. Not as a demand on anyone's total wealth, but as a measure of how much room exists for those with room to give, to redirect even a small fraction of it toward a fight that I believe is genuinely our fight too, just being fought a few thousand miles further east than the last one was. Chapter 20. A paradigm most Americans haven't updated. I want to name something before I get to the actual ask, because I think it's the single biggest reason well-meaning Americans haven't acted yet, and it has nothing to do with whether they care. Most of us are still processing this war through a mental model built in the 20th century, one where a war on the other side of the planet is fundamentally a government-to-government affair. Your government decides whether to send aid. Your government decides whether to intervene. You, the individual citizen, get to watch, vote, maybe write a letter, and otherwise wait for people in Washington to act on your behalf. That model wasn't wrong when it was built. For most of human history, an ordinary citizen genuinely had no direct channel to a foreign battlefield. The tools didn't exist. Government was the only mechanism capable of moving money, material, or influence at any meaningful scale across an ocean. That model is now out of date, and almost nobody has told the average American that it changed. I spent 4.5 years as living proof of that update. 20,000 of us, American and Allied volunteers, if you include the Allied volunteers, it's hundreds of thousands of us, working almost entirely outside any government channel, have moved verifiably hundreds of millions of dollars in non-lethal aid directly to the hands of specific soldiers, specific units, specific families, using nothing but smartphones, instant payment platforms, and a willingness to show up. That's not a workaround government tolerates. It's a capability government simply couldn't have offered a generation ago because the infrastructure for it didn't exist yet. A citizen today can identify a need, verify it, fund it, and watch it get delivered, all without a single government office touching the transaction. I don't think most Americans have actually updated their mental model to include that fact. They still think about helping Ukraine as something that happens through Congress or it doesn't happen through them at all. I've briefed senators, congressional staff, and former and current intelligence professionals on this specific point, and I hear the same thing back consistently. They all agree the capability exists. They agree it's underused. And they tell me plainly that the one thing no official in that building can manufacture for you is the will of the public, because it isn't theirs to create. It has to come from citizens themselves deciding in large enough numbers that they're willing to act. Government can respond to public will. It cannot generate it. That's always been true. But it matters more now than it used to, because for the first time, an activated public doesn't need government's permission or infrastructure to actually move the needle. It just needs to know the door is open. I think that's the actual paradigm shift this war is quietly demonstrating, whether or not anyone's named it yet. Foreign aid in the 21st century no longer has to be a government monopoly. It can be a citizen capability, exercised directly at scale that would have been unimaginable to any earlier generation of Americans who wanted to help a fight for freedom on the other side of the world and simply had no way to do it themselves. 20,000 of us have found that door already. I believe 100 million more Americans who say they support Ukraine just don't know it's there. I want to give this equation a face because I think an abstraction like citizen to citizen aid means nothing until you meet the citizens on the other end of it. There's a man named Vitaly, based in Vinnytsia, home to Ukraine's Air Force Command, who has become one of my most trusted contacts over these 4.5 years. Vitaly volunteers something like 20 hours a day, running supplies to frontline units, working himself to exhaustion, putting himself in the hospital, because he's decided that's his part to play. American donations have supplied his work directly more than once. He's one of maybe 100 Ukrainian volunteers I could name just off the top of my head from memory, each with their own version of this same story. People who left secure private sector jobs, people who told me plainly that the best use of their time in a country of 36 million was to become one of the 800,000 now serving in uniform or in direct support of the war effort as a civilian. Here's the equation I've proven over and over for 4.5 years. An American citizen plus an American veteran living in Ukraine plus a Ukrainian volunteer like Vitaly, who knows exactly what's needed and where, equals direct, verified, non-lethal support reaching the people actually fighting. I've gotten calls from Americans who know me, sometimes people I've never met in person, telling me a Ukrainian friend of theirs needs $30,000 for a specific project. I get on a video call. I vouch for it because I trust the person on the other end. The money moves. That's not a metaphor for how this could work. That's a description of something that already has, dozens of times over. Chapter 21, The Ask. I don't think most Americans lack the desire to help. I think we've lost the sense that our individual help could possibly matter against a problem this large. And so the desire quietly curdles into a kind of learned helplessness, a feeling that shows up as frustration at the news and then nothing else, because nothing else feels like it would make a difference. I want to give you something that will. I call the effort I've built out here Operation Eastern Shield, and I want to be clear about what that actually is. Not a government program, not an official military designation, but a name I've put on the volunteer work I've done for 4.5 years. And on the network of thousands of Americans who've supported it. I'm not asking you to trust an institution. I'm asking you to trust a track record. One American citizen using the freedom available to him, who has personally moved more than $15 million in donated non-lethal aid to people defending it. One tourniquet, one vehicle, one drone at a time. If you have the means and flexibility that I had in March of 2022, no dependents tying you down, a job you can step away from, military or medical or logistics experience that's actually useful on the ground, I'd ask you to seriously consider what your own version of that BBC interview looks like. What's your excuse? I mean that as a genuine question, not a guilt trip. Most people's honest answer is a good one. They got kids, a mortgage, a job that can't flex, health that won't allow it. That's fine. That's most people. This chapter isn't really for you. This chapter is for the much larger group of Americans who can't go, but can give, and who've never been asked in a way that made the ask feel concrete instead of abstract. None of that requires you to understand geopolitics. It requires you to believe that a stranger's life on the other side of the planet is worth something out of your own surplus. I believe most Americans, if asked directly, do believe exactly that. I put the specific concrete ways to act on this belief in a short section at the end of the book, deliberately separated from everything else I've told you, so that nothing in this story ever felt like it was leading you toward a transaction. The story was never the pitch. It was just the truth, as honestly as I know how to tell it. But if none of that fits your life right now, I'd ask you for something smaller and still real. Tell this story to somebody else. Share this video. Share this book. Tell them about Tatiana. Tell them about the woman who said her life was on the floor. Tell them about an 8-year-old with a 3D printer building a drone housing for his grandfather. Be the person who makes this war feel like it's happening to real people instead of just a headline, because that's the actual barrier keeping most Americans from acting. Not indifference, but distance, the sense that suffering this far away can't really be as real as it is. I went to Ukraine because a stranger on the BBC made freedom feel like a decision instead of an abstraction. I've spent 4.5 years trying to be that same stranger for as many people as I can reach. This book is the furthest extension of that effort I know how to make. But I want to close with one more thing, because I think it's the actual point underneath everything I've written so far. Epilogue. The idea in my head. Everything you have ever seen built in this world existed first as an idea in somebody's head. Every building, every business, every law, every organization that ever solved a problem too big for one person to solve alone, a Kiwanis Club, a Red Cross chapter, a nation itself, started as nothing more than a picture in someone's mind of a world that didn't exist yet, followed by a stubborn refusal to let that picture stay only a picture. I believe that it is the actual mechanism of human progress. Not resources, not permission, an idea held firmly enough by someone willing to act on it in front of other people willing to act alongside them. So here's the idea in my head, plainly, without hedging. I believe 1 million Americans could organize themselves using the same tools already sitting in our pockets around a single unifying project, funding the non-lethal survival of Ukraine's fight for its own self-determination. And in doing so, we would provide something this country badly needs proof of right now. Not proof about Ukraine, proof about us. Proof that we are still capable of the thing that made the greatest generation, setting aside what divides us long enough to do one big, hard, shared thing well, together, on purpose. I know how that sounds to a cynic. I've heard it plenty of times already, that I'm naive, that this is delusional, that one man doesn't get to talk about mobilizing 1 million people. Here's why I don't think that's true. And I'd ask you to actually sit with the reality of the world we're already living in before you file this under pie in the sky. A single YouTube video with 1 million views is not a remarkable event anymore. It happens every single day, on every platform, often for content with nothing at stake. A cat falling off the counter, a stranger's morning routine, a prank that took 10 minutes to film. If a channel with no cause behind it at all can assemble 1 million subscribers and tens of millions of views, I don't think it's delusional to believe a cause this serious, told honestly, could reach the same number of people or more. The tools already exist. 20,000 of us have already been using them for 4.5 years to raise the money this book describes. We've just never used them together with one voice aimed at one number. I believe the honest question isn't whether reaching 1 million people is possible. The evidence that it's possible is everywhere around us every day. The honest question is whether we're willing to stop being disorganized about a cause that deserves better than that. Now you've been told how and why. Here's why I believe the math actually works. And I want to make this as simple as I can rather than let the numbers get away from me. I'm one person. Over the past 4.5 years, I've personally identified more than 10,000 individual donors, people who gave a few hundred or a few $1,000s each because they knew me or heard my story and decided to trust it. That's not a hypothetical. That already happened. If one person doing this without any real infrastructure behind him can inspire 10,000 others to act, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that all of us working together on purpose instead of by accident could reach 1 million. The biggest problem I've heard over and over in 50,000 people addressed in person and the millions more reached through news coverage over 4.5 years isn't that Americans don't want to help Ukraine. It's that they don't know how. They never met me. They never met a volunteer that had come to Ukraine. They don't know about the 20,000 of us who crossed into Ukraine and built these supply lines by hand. That's the actual gap this book is trying to close. Not a gap in caring, a gap in knowing the door exists. I'm not asking anyone to take my vision on faith alone either. This isn't a plan I'm floating for the first time in this book. It's a plan I've already been executing in miniature for 4.5 years. One supply run, one tourniquet, one drone, one repaired roof at a time, with roughly $15 million of it passing through my own hands and documented as it went. I'm one of something like 20,000 American volunteers who have done versions of this same work since February of 2022, and between us, several $1 billion have already moved through volunteer and charitable channels into Ukraine's survival. That's not a hypothetical. That already happened quietly, without a coordinated national campaign behind it, without a book, without a plan to reach 1 million people on purpose. I believe that if several $1 billion can move through a scattered, disorganized, entirely grassroots effort like ours, then a deliberately organized one, 1 million people moving with intention, instead of 20,000 of us moving mostly by accident, could move an order of magnitude more. I've supported Ukraine's cause among and alongside something like 150 million Americans who already say they believe in it. And I believe we could get the cooperation of 150 million or 175 million of us to agree that something on a greatest generation scale, a war effort scale, needs to be done together, the same way that generation did it 80 years ago. Call it the greatest generation 2.0. The math isn't pie in the sky. 1 million of us, each willing to be a team captain, each finding 10 people willing to commit $177.60 a month, adds up to $1,776 a month per team, a number that echoes 1776 on purpose. 1 million team captains doing that is something the free world has never done before, which is simply this: maximize the use of the tools available to us in support of the cause of freedom we all believe in. I'm told, in rooms where I brief people about this war, senators' offices, congressional staff, defense think tanks, that the most honest assessment of Ukraine's path forward that serious people are willing to say out loud is that the best available outcome is waiting for the next American president to be more favorably disposed toward Ukraine and find some way to bring this war to a close. I want to say clearly, I don't accept that as the ceiling of what's possible. I'm not willing to wait for another election because I don't believe the fate of free people should rest on the outcome of somebody else's election 4,000 miles away on a timeline neither they or we control. I believe there's a wide gap between what this cause actually needs and what governments, ours included, have been willing to provide. And I believe that gap is exactly the size and shape of problem free citizens have solved before, without waiting for permission from people whose job it was supposed to be. Whatever comes of the war itself, and I want to be honest that some of it isn't up to us. Whether Ukraine negotiates, what territory changes hands, how this actually ends, none of that is within an American donor's control. I believe there's still one thing entirely within our control: whether we choose as a people to show up for the fight in front of us the way our grandparents showed up for theirs. I want us to get at least that one thing right. Not because it guarantees an outcome in Ukraine, because it proves something about who we still are at a moment when a lot of us have quietly started to wonder. I think about Dr. King standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial describing a country that didn't exist yet, in language bold enough that a great many people listening probably thought he was asking for something impossible. I don't compare myself to him. I want to be careful about that because the causes are different and the stakes to my own life are nothing like what he risked. But I do think the lesson underneath that speech applies here, that casting a vision boldly out loud in front of other people is not naivete. It's the actual first step of anything that has ever gotten built. Nothing gets created without first being imagined by someone willing to say it out loud before it's true. So I'm saying it out loud. I believe 1 million of us is possible. I believe we can fund this at a scale that actually matters. I believe the way we prove any of that is simply by starting. Not by winning the argument with every skeptic first, but by doing the thing visibly, so the skeptics have something real to look at instead of a theory to dismiss. That's the whole idea in my head. Now I'm asking you to help me make it real. I told you earlier in this book about performing on Khreshchatyk in front of Kyiv City Hall with the deputy mayor's written approval secured in just 4 days. That happened on May 28th, 2026, just a few weeks before I finished writing this book. And I think about it often because it proves the idea in the paragraph above isn't just something I'm imagining. It's already alive. An American citizen with no formal standing asked a foreign government for its permission to publicly perform and exercise the rights that are granted to American citizens in Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens alike. And I got a fast, clear yes. If that's possible, I believe almost everything else is possible in this book too. I want to leave you with the phrase that I actually said more than once to reporters who asked me why I did any of this, including the Washington Post, in an interview that ran while I was still deciding whether to get on that plane. I told them I wanted to be in the room where it happened. I've thought a lot about why that phrase came out of my mouth instead of some other one, and I think it traces back to Marquis de Lafayette, a young foreign volunteer, not yet 20 years old, who crossed an ocean to fight for a country that wasn't his in a revolution that wasn't his either, because he believed the cause was worth his life regardless of which flag he'd been born under. Historians will tell you plainly that the training and tactical experience Lafayette and other European officers brought to the Continental Army shaped outcomes on specific battlefields that might otherwise have gone differently. He wasn't a symbol. He was substance on the ground at moments that mattered. I think about that every time someone asks why an American would go stand in a war that isn't technically his country's war. Lafayette is the answer. He's proof it's been done before, that it mattered when it was done, and that nothing about doing it required being born under the flag you were fighting to defend. So when I told those reporters I wanted to be in the room where it happened, that's what I meant. Not a metaphor, not a slogan. An actual American citizen using the actual freedom available to him, his passport, his savings, his flexible schedule, his choice, to go stand in the room where history was actively being decided, the same way Lafayette once did. I believe that opportunity doesn't belong to me specifically or specially. I believe it belongs to every one of the roughly 1.2 to 1.6 billion of us who currently live somewhere in the free world. Americans, Europeans, allied citizens everywhere. And that most of us have simply never been told plainly that the room is open and the door isn't locked. I'd ask you to reconsider the map you carry around in your head. Most of us think the world is a patchwork of separate countries with hard lines between them. I've come to think of it differently after 4.5 years of watching how it actually works. There is a free world, one continuous fabric, running from South Korea across the Pacific, through Hawaii and Guam, across the American mainland, across the Atlantic, through every free nation in Europe, all the way to a farmhouse in the Donbass in Ukraine, 5,000 miles from Fargo. We trade with each other. We do commerce with each other. Roughly 20% of the human beings alive today share that same basic framework of rights and self-government, whatever local variations exist inside of it. And Ukraine, right now, is fighting to stay inside that fabric rather than be cut back out of it by force. If you think in military terms for a moment, the front line is in the Donbass in Ukraine. But you, reading this at home in America, are the rear. And the rear has a job in every war that's ever been fought. Support, supply, morale, the thing that makes the front line survivable in the first place. This book is one man's vision for what that support could look like at scale. I've spent these years saying it out loud everywhere I could get a microphone or a camera or a stage. Something over 100, maybe 200 interviews from inside Ukraine. I've delivered speeches to more than 50,000 people addressed in person across events all across America these last 4 years. Every podcast and outlet that would have me. In business, we talk about scaling a good idea until it reaches everyone it could help. I believe it's time to scale this one the same way. Not through governments moving at the pace governments move, but through the same 20,000 volunteers who've already proven one supply run at a time that free citizens acting on their own volition can move real resources to a real fight for the same freedom this country has spent 250 years defining itself by. I believe the will of the free people is the most powerful weapon on earth. Not the largest army, not the deepest treasury. The plain, stubborn will of ordinary citizens who decide, together and on purpose, to use their freedom for someone else's sake. That weapon has toppled empires before, and I believe it can be turned toward good again in our own time, if enough of us decide to pick it up. I wanted to be in the room where it happened. I'm asking you to help me build a bigger room. How to help. Everything in the pages before this one was the truth, told as honestly as I know how to tell it, with nothing asked of you in return. This page is different, and I wanted the line between the two to be visible rather than blurred. I want to start with something I've heard directly on American soil thousands of times over the past 4.5 years, because I think it's the single most important thing standing between where we are and where this cause needs to be. People want to help Ukraine. Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals. I don't think I've met more than a handful of Americans who, once they actually understood what was happening here, didn't want to do something about it. There are somewhere between 100 and 150 million of us who already say so. The disconnect isn't caring. It's not knowing how, and not knowing which channel is reliable once you find it. So here is exactly how, laid out as plainly as I know how to lay it out. Step 1. You're inspired. You've read this book, or enough of it, and something in it moved you toward wanting to do something. That's the whole first step, noticing that feeling instead of letting it pass. If you're wondering whether you can actually afford to act on it, I'd ask you to think about it this way. $177.60 a month is not a wild ask for a citizen in the richest country the world has ever produced. You might not have it sitting free in your budget today. Maybe most people don't right away. But I'd bet for a lot of you, it's closer than you think. Once you look honestly at a subscription you don't use, or the coffees you buy without thinking about it, or some other small extra, making that trade isn't a sacrifice in any real sense. It's an opportunity, a chance to show your kids in your community and the next generation, in a small, concrete way, what it actually looks like to give up something for a cause bigger than yourself, the same way the greatest generation did 80 years ago. Step 2. You decide your role. There are 2 ways to be a part of this, and neither requires you to be the only one funding anything. You can become a team captain, responsible for finding 10 people, including yourself if you'd like, who together commit $1,776 a month, or $177.60 apiece. Or you can simply be one of those 10, a monthly contributor, without taking on the organizing role. Either way, here's what you get in return that no earlier generation of Americans has ever had access to: direct contact with the people actually in the fight. I want you to think for a second about the Iraq War and how remarkable it felt at that time that CNN had reporters embedded directly with American units, giving us a level of access to an active war that no one had seen before. That was a genuine leap forward in how ordinary citizens experienced a distant conflict. What I'm describing here goes further. As a team captain or monthly contributor, I can connect you to secure communication channels with actual soldiers and volunteers and citizens on the ground who will share updates, when it's safe to do so, about what's actually happening on the front lines of a war, with the potential to shape the rest of this century. You won't have to rely on a news cycle to tell you what's going on in Ukraine. You'll be able to hear it, sometimes in close to real time, from the people living it. Step 3. You share the news. None of this works at scale unless we actually get to scale, and that means telling people. We need to assemble 1 million of us, and that number is not pie in the sky, it's simply necessary. And it's achievable with the tools that already exist and already cost nothing to use. If you're tired of watching this war grind on and wishing it would end, sharing this book or a video or a single story from it with 10 people who might feel the same way is the most concrete thing you can do today. Ask them to do the same. Have them share it with the 10 most influential people that they know, and have those 10 influential people share it with the 10 most influential people that they know. That's how a real number gets built, not through one viral moment, but through thousands of honest individual passes between people who already trust each other. If you want to see any of this with your own eyes, that door is open too. There are empty hotel rooms all across Ukraine, and American veterans and volunteers already leading this effort can show you exactly where that money goes and introduce you to the Ukrainian soldiers and citizens living inside this fight. You don't have to take my word for any of it. You can come here. Next, you could join the weekly call. Every Sunday, I, Mark J. Lindquist, I'm hosting a standing video call at 9 p.m. Ukrainian time, which generally works out to be 2 p.m. in the East Coast, 1 p.m. in the Central Time Zone, though the exact hour can shift by 1 hour or so during the weeks a year Ukraine and the U.S. change their clocks on different dates. So double check the current time before you join at our website. On that call, I tell stories from here in Ukraine that most people have never heard. I'll share exactly what we're raising money for that week and walk through where recent donations actually went, the specific non-lethal aid that those donations bought, and who received it. Again, details on how to join are at markhelpsukraine.com. Now, the specific ways to give, the specific ways to help, depending on how much of your life this asks for. If you have $30 of surplus this month, that's the cost of a single combat tourniquet. The same $30 item I've delivered by hand more times than I can count. A one-time gift at this scale, multiplied across readers, can add up faster than you'd think. Give at markhelpsukraine.com. If you can give monthly, consider a standing donation at whatever level fits your life. I've chosen $177.60 a month as a personal target, a tenth of the $1,776 a full team commits together. But any recurring amount, even small, is worth more to a volunteer supply line than a single larger gift because it lets us plan instead of scramble. Set it up at markhelpsukraine.com. If you want to organize, find 9 other people who feel the way you do after reading this and build something durable together. A giving circle, a local fundraiser, a standing group commitment, the way the greatest generation organized through Kiwanis and Lions and Rotary and Legion Halls a century ago. Post about it. Say it plainly in public that your family gave because freedom isn't free. Not as a slogan, but as a fact you're willing to put your name behind. I believe that kind of public, ordinary generosity does more to move the next 100 people than any speech I could give. Register your team at markhelpsukraine.com. And If you're an accredited investor and want to explore something beyond charitable giving, you should know that the Ukrainian government has built an official platform called Brave One, specifically to channel investment into Ukraine's own domestic defense technology sector. Companies building the drones and systems that are keeping soldiers alive right now and will keep American soldiers alive in the next iteration of war. I'm telling you this exists because I think you deserve the full picture of what's possible, not a partial one. I'm not a licensed financial advisor, and I'm not going to pitch you on a specific investment from these pages. That's not my place. It's not even legal for me to do it. If this interests you, bring the name Brave One to your own advisor and let them evaluate it properly. If you have relevant skills but not money, medical, logistics, mechanical, or military experience is often more valuable on the ground than a check. If that's you, and you're seriously considering your own version of the question I asked myself in 2022, I'd encourage you to research thoroughly, talk to people who have already gone to Ukraine, and go in with clear eyes about the risk and the responsibility. Talking to someone who's already made this trip isn't hard to arrange. I've talked about the 20,000 Americans who have come to Ukraine since February of 2022. There are roughly 300 to 400 people from every single state in America who have gone to Ukraine to volunteer, and for a large majority of them, a local news station back home did a story on that trip. Search your own state's name alongside the words volunteer going to Ukraine, or Google, or whatever AI tool you're using, and you'll almost certainly find a name and a face and a way to reach them. Ask them what it was actually like in Ukraine. Or follow my own channels where I try to tell you exactly what it's like to be inside a war zone as honestly as I know how. If you want to give through an established 501c3, a nonprofit called Aided accepts donations specifically to support this work. I help support that organization alongside my buddy Ian out here in Ukraine. We've been here since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. You can mail a check made out to Aided Incorporated to 18 Laurel Way, Norfolk, Connecticut, 06058 in the United States. Please include your name or a reference memo so that we can continue to keep you updated on where the impact was made with your donation. For wire transfers, go to markhelpsukraine.com and the information will be there as well. We are currently rebuilding our website to make it optimized for this major campaign. It will eventually be at aided.org, and credit card transactions will be able to be processed there. If none of that fits your life right now, simply tell someone this story, share this video, share this book. Tell them about Tatiana. Tell them about the 8-year-old with a 3D printer. That costs nothing, and it's still real support. Whatever you choose, the fastest way to reach me directly is to join the Sunday call at 9 p.m. Ukraine time to find out exactly where the current effort stands. You can go to markhelpsukraine.com or you can email me, markhelpsukraine@gmail.com. You can also donate directly through PayPal at markhelpsukraine. I'm keeping the specifics on the website, markhelpsukraine.com, rather than locked permanently into these pages because the channel may evolve, and I'd rather you have ways to find the current verifiable version of this work rather than a printed instruction that can't be updated once it's on your shelf. I started this book with a line from Thomas Paine, a line he wrote in the winter of 1776, believing that one small unlikely cause could belong to the whole world if enough people decided it did. I still believe that. I've watched it proven true in a bombed-out subway station in Kharkiv, in a farmhouse kitchen with the lights out, in a bunker where a room full of strangers sang every word of a dead American singer's songs back to me in a language most of them didn't speak. The cause of Ukraine is the cause of all mankind. And mankind, it turns out, is more generous and more willing than most of us have been told. It's in the hands of ordinary people who decide one choice at a time that freedom is worth showing up for. The same choice my father made in a village in Malaysia, the same choice a stranger on the BBC made without ever knowing he'd hand it to me. The same choice available to you right now on whatever page of your own life you happen to be standing on. I believe the room where it happens is bigger than any of us think, and I believe there's a seat with your name on it whenever you're ready to take it. One last thought, and then I'll let you go. Ukrainians dream of victory the same way we would in their position. A country intact, a son who comes home, a night without a siren, for good. That dream is theirs to win, and I believe they can. Here's the dream that's mine to name as an American. Every year, without much debate, we spend close to $1 trillion defending our own freedom, an amount so large most of us never stop to ask whether it's worth it, because we've already decided that it is. If we accept that price tag for our own freedom without blinking, I don't see how we can look at Ukraine fighting for the same freedom under the same principles and call $100 billion a year too much to ask. It's not a bigger dream than theirs, it's the same cause, and I'm simply asking my own country to fund it at the scale we already fund our own. I dream of an American public that decides together to back that dream with the sheer weight of a free people choosing, on purpose, to be too generous and too organized for tyranny to outlast. I dream of 1 million Americans who've never met a Ukrainian soldier deciding to fund one anyway. I dream of this book going out of date within a few years, not because the need disappeared, but because we actually met it. That's the dream. I believe it's worth exactly what we already believe our own freedom is worth. Thank you for reading this far. That alone means the room just got bigger. Mark J. Lindquist, Summer 2026, Lviv, Ukraine. About the author. Mark J. Lindquist is a nationally recognized motivational speaker and world touring entertainer who has performed live for over 4 million people in 27 countries and all 50 states throughout his career. As an actor, he has appeared in ABC's Lost, CBS's Hawaii Five-0, and the Universal Studios movie Battleship. As a guest artist for the largest sporting events in America, Mark has performed for the NBA, MLB, NCAA, MLS, WNBA, and the NFL on Monday and Thursday Night Football, and has performed live on national television for over 100 million people. He has performed for Grammy-winning artists, Academy Award-nominated actors, secretaries of defense, the director of the CIA, the White House chief of staff, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO Europe, and the President of the United States of America. As a professional communicator and motivator, he has performed on stage in all 50 states for Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies. Senior leaders from McDonald's, Starbucks, Amazon, Microsoft, Walmart, IBM, Deloitte, 3M, Best Buy, UPS, FedEx, the United States military, as well as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and BAE Systems have all raved about Mark's electrifying keynotes at live events across America. Mark has been featured in The Washington Post, on CBS Saturday Morning, CNN, NBC, Fox News, ABC, BBC, PBS, Forbes, Getty Images, The Independent UK, Stars and Stripes, Voice of America, The Washington Times, WGN, The Star Tribune, and has been interviewed by the New York Times. Since March of 2022, Mark has been on a self-directed humanitarian mission to Ukraine and has delivered over $15 million worth of aid to those in need in eastern Ukraine. He has received a medal for outstanding volunteerism from the chairman of the Parliament of Ukraine, and his work has been featured in major media outlets worldwide. Mark is a former sergeant in the United States Air Force and an Afghanistan war veteran who lives in Lviv, Ukraine. The Cause of All Mankind by Mark J. Lindquist.